Hey guys, tonight I find myself standing in the cool, slightly damp air of an underground cheese cellar. The stone walls are sweating. The wooden shelves are sagging under the weight of wheels so large they look like they could crush a man. And the smell, oh, the smell, is a cocktail of ancient socks, salted butter, and something vaguely reminiscent of a medieval barnyard. I take a cautious step forward, the floor creaking underfoot, and I think, I probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The idea of Renaissance Italians writing entire books about cheese might sound absurd, like a long-lost Monty Python sketch. But tonight, I'm here to tell you, it's absolutely true. These weren't silly pamphlets or grocery lists. These were serious, thoughtful, often wildly poetic odes to cheese. And not just any cheese, they're cheese. Pecorino, Parmigiano, Robiola, each with its own mythology, science, and sometimes moral compass. As I run my hand gently over a dusty cheese, labeled 1478, I start to feel like I'm trespassing in a museum that no one knows about. One where history isn't displayed in glass cases, but aged slowly in wooden crates, one layer of mold at a time. There's a flicker of candlelight at the end of the cellar. I follow it, half expecting to meet some spectral cheesemonger from 500 years ago, still scribbling his final notes on the perfect wheel of Montejo. Instead, I find a book, leather-bound, the cover cracked, and nearly fused shut by time. I pry it open, and there in shaky Latin are diagrams of cows, calendars of milking times, and annotations about how the moonlight affects the curd's attitude. The book has no title, just a blocky stamp, Biblioteca di Formaggi, Library of Cheese. This isn't just some diary. This is a manual, a manifesto. Someone cared enough about cheese to record every step, every feeling, every tiny curdled revelation. And I realize this was normal. This was culture. In Renaissance Italy, people didn't just eat cheese. They worshipped it. They battled over it. They used it in love spells and lawsuits. And while painters like Da Vinci and sculptors like Michelangelo were busy redefining beauty, there was another group, less famous, more fragrant, dedicated to turning cheese into literature. Historians still argue whether this whole cheese obsession was driven by genuine passion or just good old-fashioned ego. After all, if you're a 15th century nobleman with a villa and a vineyard, writing a 300-page treatise on your personal sheep cheese might be your way of telling the world, I've arrived. And look, I get it. Cheese is one of the few foods that's both humble and heroic. It starts as milk, innocent, soft-spoken, a bit bland. But give it time, heat, bacteria, and just the right insult from nature, and boom, it becomes a story. A scent, a symbol. As I ease down onto an overturned barrel and pull out a small wedge of something called Stracchino Vecchio, I feel a strange calm. It's soft, slightly nutty, smells like warm hay, and melts on my tongue like the last memory of summer. I close my eyes, and for a moment, I'm back in a Renaissance garden, sitting beside a marble fountain, watching poets argue over whether gorgonzola is too vulgar for a noble palate. And in this quiet moment, I start to understand why cheese mattered so much. It wasn't just food, it was identity, geography, pride, a dairy-based form of nationalism long before the idea of modern countries even existed. Italy wasn't one unified nation during the Renaissance. It was a patchwork of city-states, Florence, Venice, Milan, Siena, each with its own language, rivalries, and yes, its own cheeses. And you better believe that a cheese from Parma wasn't just from Parma. It was Parma. It smelled of its hills, its cows, its stubborn farmers. To insult a region's cheese was to insult its entire existence. Which makes me think, how many political arguments started with a wheel of cheese on the table? Somewhere in the layers of history, the cheese books began to appear. One of the earliest is attributed to Pantaleone da Confienza, a 15th century physician from Piedmont. His Summa Lacta Cinerum is the closest thing we have to a Renaissance cheese encyclopedia. It reads like a fever dream of dairy. Over 50 cheeses cataloged, each with notes on texture, origin, medicinal properties, and ideal pairings. He even throws in commentary on which cheeses make you gassy and which ones can cool a hot liver. A hot liver. I chuckle. Apparently, scholars debated this. Cheese was seen as both nourishing and dangerous. It could fuel a peasant's long day in the field, or, if eaten carelessly, tip your body's humors into chaos. That was serious business back then. The line between cheese and plate could be one bite too thick. Still seated in the cheese cellar, I notice another book, this one thinner with faded gold trim. It's handwritten, less clinical. A personal diary? No, it's a cheese poem. Dozens of them, actually, all rhyming. Some tragic. One dedicated to a moldy goat cheese too good for this sinful world. I reread that line. Then I eat another bite of stracchino. Outside, a storm rolls in. The thunder echoes through the cellar, vibrating the shelves and wobbling the wheels ever so slightly. I tell myself it's just weather, not the ghosts of cheesemongers past, angry that I'm reading their secrets. But still, I put the book back gently, and I whisper a promise. I'll tell their story right. Every moldy, funky, beautiful part of it. I don't know what it says about me, that I now associate wealth not with gold or jewels, but with cheese wheels stacked to the ceiling. Not metaphorically, literally stacked. Have you ever stood in a storeroom where the Parmesan is insured? Because I have. And let me tell you, it changes you. It's sometime around 1470, and I'm trailing a merchant through the stone archways of a bustling Italian port. The air smells like sea salt, sweat, and something vaguely nutty. Ah yes, that's the cheese. Merchants are shouting in a jumble of Tuscan, Venetian, and Genoese dialects. Crates of olive oil, bolts of silk, dried figs, amphorae of wine, and then, among them, crates stamped with wax seals bearing the unmistakable crest of Parma. Inside, Parmigiano Reggiano, in great hulking chunks, swaddled like sacred relics. This is not just food. This is fortune. Cheese, particularly the hard, aged kind that travels well, was a backbone of Renaissance trade. Historians still argue whether it ranked up there with salt and spices, but the economic footprint of cheese, especially in Italy, was enormous. A well-aged Parmigiano could fetch a price comparable to silver in the right market. Not only because it tasted good, but because it kept. It aged. It became better over time. In a world before refrigeration, this was culinary magic. The merchant I'm shadowing, let's call him Lorenzo, because every third man is named Lorenzo, lead me into a counting house where scribes are literally calculating cheese futures. Prices fluctuate based on aging time, the weather during grazing season, and which regions are having turf wars. There's a running joke among them. If the Duke of Milan frowns, the price of goat cheese drops in Naples. I chuckle politely. It's not funny, but I'm also trying to blend in. I'm handed a parchment to examine. It's a receipt for 50 wheels of Parmigiano, paid not in coins, but in land. Yes, land. A vineyard in Medina, traded for a stack of cheese. You really can't make this stuff up. That's how you know it was serious. Wealthy families began to hoard cheese like treasure. Some even stored wheels in underground vaults. And when dowries were arranged, there were negotiations not just over gold and linens, but dairy. Yes, I'll give you my daughter's hand, and 25 wheels of sheep's milk cheese aged no less than 2 seasons. Romantic, right? But here's where it gets even more fun. Cheese was also used in taxes. Local lords collected cheese as part of a feudal levy. Imagine trying that now. Sir, your 2025 property tax is due. We accept credit, debit, or a 3-year-old pecorino. This is the world I'm walking through. A world where cheese is not just nourishment, it's currency. It's prestige. And for the educated elite, writing about it became a way to flex both culinary and intellectual muscles. I end up in Florence next, watching a young clerk pen letters in an airy library filled with scrolls and legal documents. But what catches my eye is the small, private journal hidden under his desk. He flips to a page and reads aloud a note to himself. 3 wheels to be reserved for the Medici banquet. pair with early truffle honey. Mention again the theory that aging over marble intensifies flavor. He underlines that last part twice. That's when it hits me. These people were theorizing about cheese the way others debated astronomy or poetry. And sometimes they were the same people. Lorenzo de' Medici, the very same one who funded Botticelli and hired Michelangelo, was known to host cheese-tasting evenings where scholars debated whether mold was a divine accident or a demonic intrusion. Historians still argue whether that's true or exaggerated, but I like to believe it. And then there were the bankers. Florentine financiers began investing in cheese aging. No, seriously. They would purchase young wheels and age them for resale at a profit. The cheese market became so robust that in some cities, there were specialized notaries just for dairy contracts. Want to sue someone for watering down your ricotta? There's paperwork for that. Want to transfer cheese rights to your cousin in Bologna? There's a seal for that too. I even came across a public record from Venice documenting the arrest of a man accused of cheese misrepresentation. Apparently, he tried to pass off a salty wheel of southern Cavallo as aged Alpine cow's milk. Scandalous. But not everything about this cheesy economy was smooth. Fraud was rampant. Spoilage could ruin fortunes. Wars disrupted trade routes. And rivalries between regions sometimes flared up into cheese-related propaganda. One pamphlet from Siena mocked the pasty, limp rinds of Florentine cheese like it was political satire. I nearly spit out my bread laughing. Still, the industry endured. Why? Because cheese was versatile. It could be traded, taxed, gifted, consumed, hoarded, aged, or used in religious offerings. And, as we'll see later, sometimes launched as projectiles. Yes, really. Just wait. Back in a warehouse, a cheese broker shows me his ledger. The margins are filled not with numbers, but tasting notes. Sharp as a nobleman's tongue. Grainy like an old fresco. I ask him why he keeps them. He shrugs. So I remember what mattered most. I like that. As the sun begins to set over the Arno River, casting long golden shadows across Florence's rooftops, I realize that I haven't eaten in hours. So I slice into a sliver of Parmigiano. The good kind, the stuff with those crunchy tyrosine crystals that snap like flecks of salt, and I chew slowly, letting it melt on my tongue. It tastes like butter and wood smoke with a faint echo of hay. In this bite, there's history, trade, greed, art, and somehow, even poetry. I lean back against the stones of the warehouse and think. In the Renaissance, the richest people didn't just write checks. They wrote cheese books. It's well past midnight now, and I'm sitting by the hearth of a crumbling villa outside Parma, chewing on a hunk of cheese so old I feel like I should apologize before biting it. The fire crackles softly, casting flickers of orange across the dusty frescoes above me. Somewhere nearby, a nightingale is singing, or maybe it's just a very melodic goat. Either way, it feels right. This piece of Parmigiano Reggiano, though it's different. Dense, fragrant, layered with flavor like an ancient manuscript with too many footnotes. As I nibble, I begin to understand something that Renaissance Italians took deadly seriously. This wasn't just cheese, it was philosophy. You see, Parmigiano wasn't just eaten, it was revered, treated almost like a relic. In fact, some noble families literally stored wheels of it in reliquaries meant for saint bones. One particularly devout, or maybe just very dramatic. Countess left a detail while stating her best aged wheel should be buried beside her. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or she was just that fond of dairy. But let's talk about the paradox. The Parmesan paradox. In Renaissance markets, Parmigiano Reggiano was outrageously expensive. It was also considered a food of the people. Everyone, from peasants to popes, ate it. Rich folks grated it onto truffle-stuffed pasta. Laborers gnawed on chunks of it with dry bread and wine. It was both the poor man's protein and the rich man's garnish. A social equalizer that somehow remained a status symbol. And because it traveled well, it became one of Italy's top exports. Imagine this. Crates of Parmesan floating down the Po River, loaded onto Venetian ships, and carted off to Vienna, Constantinople, even as far as the courts of France. It was called the King of Cheeses, and not by accident. But of course, wherever there's treasure, there are forgers. Cheese fraud in the Renaissance was a real problem. Unscrupulous vendors would paint fake rinds, stamp fraudulent seals, and even soak inferior cheeses in brine to mimic the salty aging of the real deal. 1492, Florentine court record details a scandal involving counterfeit cheese wheels of Spanish origin passed as Parmigiano. The accused claimed innocence. The judge ordered a taste test. I kid you not. Here's where it gets especially weird. There was an actual cheese tribunal in Parma for a short time in the late 15th century. A council of experts, known as the Consiglio del Latte, reviewed cheese-related complaints. Disputes over aging time, moisture content, rind integrity. These were debated with the gravity of a papal conclave. Witnesses were called. Samples were presented. One record mentions an expert sniffer who testified after spending 12 years in a cheese cave. That's commitment. And then there were the cheese codes. Before labeling laws, noble producers branded their wheels with family crests. Some included cryptic Latin phrases like fortitudo in lact, strength in milk, or veritas sub rindum, truth beneath the rind. It's like Da Vinci's Code, but dairy. Speaking of Da Vinci, there's an ongoing scholarly debate about whether he sketched a cheese press in one of his notebooks. The drawing, buried between diagrams of war machines and flying devices, shows a contraption suspiciously similar to a Renaissance cheese press. Some say it's proof that Leonardo dabbled in dairy science. Others say it's just a wine press. But I like to imagine him, frustrated by physics, turning to the comfort of curds. Back at the villa, the wind howls softly through a cracked shutter. I warm my hands near the fire and let the flavors of the cheese settle on my tongue. Nutty, crystalline, with the faintest whisper of wildflowers and old oak. How can something so humble taste like memory? The cheese books from this era don't just list ingredients or instructions. They meditate. They muse. One writer described Parmigiano as the proof that decay can lead to divinity. Another warned that eating too much would render the blood sluggish and promote melancholia. Ah, yes, cheese-induced sadness. Who among us hasn't been there? There's a particularly eccentric passage I love, written by a Milanese poet in 1483, who declared, "When I am old, and my bones fragile as rind, I shall take comfort not in gold, nor wine, but in the company of cheese aged longer than memory." That line stuck with me the first time I read it. Still does. What I admire most is that these people understood aging, not just of food, but of life itself. Cheese became a metaphor for time, for patience, for transformation. Milk spoils, curdles, firms, ages, hardens, and becomes something entirely new. And so do we. So perhaps they weren't obsessed with cheese just because it tasted good. Maybe it was because it made sense of their world. It was science, it was story, it was soul. I leaned back in my chair, the fire dying low. Another bite of Parmesan. It crunches between my teeth, those little crystals of time doing their quiet dance. Somewhere deep inside the wheel, someone's history is still alive. And I'm here for it. The first time I held a Renaissance cheese treatise, I was wearing gloves. Not because it was particularly delicate, though it was, but because the curator glared at me like I was about to commit a dairy-related crime. I get it. This wasn't a cookbook. This was a cultural artifact. The book in question was about the size of a hardbound notebook, its leather cover darkened with age and flecked with what I desperately hoped was ink. Its spine cracked when opened like a knee joint in winter. The title? The Lactobus ETK size, which loosely translates to on milks and cheeses. Written sometime around 1480 by a lesser-known scholar named Matteo di Bartolomeo, it's a loving, bizarre, incredibly detailed account of all things cheese. Part almanac, part religious experience. And yes, someone actually sat down and thought, you know what this world needs? A full-length manuscript about curds. Matteo wasn't alone. Renaissance scholars had an astonishing habit of writing entire books on topics most modern folks would dedicate a blog post to, if that. They wrote treatises on cloud shapes, on the moral implications of pears, on the virtues of bathing precisely twice per month. So, of course, cheese got its literary moment. I flipped carefully through Mateo's work. The first chapter is a surprisingly poetic meditation on milk as the soul of beasts. I don't even know what that means, but I highlight it mentally. He goes on to classify cheeses by region, milk type, aging method, and even moon phase. Yes, moon phase. Historians still argue whether Mateo truly believed lunar gravity could influence coagulation or if he was just riffing off the era's obsession with celestial nonsense. I mean, this is the same period where people refused to cut their hair during an eclipse. Each page includes tiny marginal notes, some from Mateo, some added later. There's a beautiful sketch of a cow, serenely chewing grass, beside a footnote that reads, "This one gives milk with the temperament of an August breeze." What does that even mean? Was the cow relaxed? Chatty? Wearing linen? Still, there's a strange charm to it all. As I read, I started to understand that cheese books weren't just culinary manuals. They were expressions of personal pride, regional identity, even philosophy. Mateo refers to his native Lombardy's cheese as the essence of my homeland rendered firm, then eternal. That's the kind of love language Hallmark cards can't touch. A few pages later, there's a long passage detailing how to build a proper cheese aging cellar. Stone walls no less than 2 feet thick, moisture managed with strategically placed sage bundles, and ventilation grates aligned with the prevailing winds. It's basically architectural theory, but for cheddar. What really makes me pause, though, is a chapter titled Contra Formas Ilienas, against foreign forms. It's Mateo's diatribe against non-Italian cheeses. He calls Swiss cheeses brutish bricks and declares that French brie melts like weak men's resolve. Ouch. It's cheese-based xenophobia, and yet, somehow, he makes it sound like a national anthem. That's when it clicks. Cheese, to Mateo and his peers, was as much a battlefield as it was a delicacy. In a fragmented Italy of city-states constantly vying for prestige, what you ate, and more importantly, what you wrote about eating, was a form of cultural warfare. You weren't just describing flavor. You were planting a flag. And writing about it? That was like commissioning a statue. A monument to your region's superiority, cast not in bronze, but in buffalo milk. As I turn the last page, I find an inscription in Latin, written in a trembling hand. "Let no man claim knowledge who does not know cheese." I don't know if it's Mateo's original thought or a later edition, but I decide to adopt it as my new personal motto. I tuck the book back into its velvet-lined cradle, bow slightly. Yes, I bowed to a cheese manuscript, and step back out into the hallway of the archive. My gloves feel ridiculous now. My fingers itch to hold something real, something edible. Fortunately, a nearby market is still open. This is Italy, after all. I wander through its candlelit stalls, passing bundles of herbs, hanging salamis, stacks of olive oil tins painted with Tuscan landscapes. And then I see it. A vendor with rows of cheese under bell jars, each labeled in impossibly elegant script. I ask if he's ever heard of Matteo di Bartolomeo. He squints. "Ah, see, the cheese priest," he laughs. Apparently, that's what locals call him. A blend of reverence and mockery. A man who took milk too seriously. The vendor hands me a sliver of an aged Lombard cheese Matteo once described as hard enough to outlive empires. It's crumbly, intense, with a dry nuttiness that makes my mouth water. I chew slowly. Somewhere deep in the flavor, I swear I taste parchment. Cheese writing might seem ridiculous now, but back then, it was revolutionary. A way to preserve not just recipes, but identity, culture, passion. And for Matteo, it was everything. By the time I reach the monastery, I smell cheese before I see it. It's sharp, almost peppery, with a hint of straw and something oddly metallic. I follow the scent like a cartoon bloodhound through winding stone corridors, past frescoes of saints and martyrdoms, until I find the source. A cavernous room lit by candlelight, filled wall to wall with wheels of cheese. Rows upon rows, some fresh and pale, others dark, cracked, and centuries old. And in the middle of it all, a monk is praying over a vat of curdling milk. I'm not hallucinating. This was common in the Renaissance. Monks weren't just scribes and choir boys. They were cheese makers, and in many cases, the best in the business. Their isolation, discipline, and obsession with process made monasteries perfect for controlled dairy production. Some of Europe's most prized cheeses, Trappist, Fontina, even the early forms of Gorgonzola, have monastic roots. And here, in northern Italy, cheese and church went hand in hand. But of course, that doesn't mean it was without conflict. I sit on a wooden bench in the corner and listen as Brother Angelo stirs a copper cauldron with a paddle the size of a canoe oar. He tells me they wake before dawn to begin the process. Milking, curdling, pressing, aging. Cheese is a prayer, he says solemnly, as if that explains everything. And to the monks, it really was. Cheese was sustenance, offering, and metaphor. One 15th century Benedictine manuscript compares the transformation of milk into cheese to the purification of the soul. The spoiled is separated, the pure is pressed, the whole becomes firm and endures. Beautiful, slightly gross, perfectly Renaissance. But not everyone was thrilled with monastic cheese making. As cheese began to evolve from peasant fare to high society indulgence, accusations of gluttony crept in. Certain church officials raised eyebrows at how much cheese the monasteries were producing and consuming. Canon law, after all, had rules about fasting and simplicity. How does that square with wheels of pungent, truffle-aged luxury? Historians still argue whether this backlash was truly moral concern or just jealousy. One papal advisor in 1489 even wrote a letter scolding the monks of Monteverdi for hosting lavish cheese feasts under the guise of holy devotion. A polite way of saying, stop throwing brie ragers in your cloister. Of course, the monks defended themselves. Brother Angelo hands me a crumbling parchment, protected in a wax sleeve. It's a copy of a sermon from 1476 titled In Defension KCI, in Defense of Cheese. It's spectacular. The monk who wrote it, Father Silvestro, argues that cheese is not a temptation, but a tool of discipline. He compares the patience needed to age cheese with the patience required for spiritual growth. He then quotes scripture, completely out of context, to argue that he who ferments his food rightly shall ferment his soul likewise. The logic is slippery. The conviction is rock solid. What's even more fascinating is that cheese wasn't just made in monasteries. It was recorded in their annals, counted in their ledgers, even mentioned in their dreams. I read one monk's journal that recorded a vision where an angel offered him a wheel of righteousness seasoned with virtue. Honestly, if that's what heaven's like, sign me up. Still, not every monk was a cheese mystic. Some just saw it as survival. In harsh winters, when crops failed and meat was scarce, cheese kept them alive. And by perfecting their methods, they created a product that could be traded, gifted to nobles, or used to curry favor with Rome. That's how cheese found its way into diplomacy. Brother Angelo tells me the story of a 1493 envoy who delivered 10 wheels of aged pecorino to a cardinal in Florence. The message was clear: we're not rich, but we're useful. And it worked. The monastery received funding for repairs the following year. I sip from a tiny wooden cup of whey as Angelo shows me the aging room. Cool, damp, lit with shafts of dusty light from narrow windows. The air is thick, humid, and absolutely saturated with scent. He opens a wheel, offers me a taste. It's firm, nutty, and pungent, with a whisper of lemon. I'm not religious, but I do close my eyes. This one was aged exactly 777 days, he says proudly. Holy number. Right, of course. As we leave the cellar, he shows me their library. Not just scripture, but cheese records, thick tomes documenting every batch they've made since 1402. Notes on cows, grass, weather, temperature, even the moods of the monks involved. I find one entry that reads, Brother Vittorio wept while stirring. Result, unusually soft rind. I have questions. I decide not to ask. Back outside, the sun is rising. The stone walls glow orange. The bells begin to ring, and I wave goodbye to Brother Angelo as he returns to his cauldron. As I walk away, I can't help but think maybe they were right. Maybe cheese is a kind of prayer, a way to endure, a way to transform, or maybe it's just really, really good. Either way, I'm converted. I never thought I'd find myself at a cheese banquet where the guest of honor wasn't a person, but a wheel of robiola dressed in gold leaf and lavender petals. And yet, here I am, perched at a long table in a frescoed Florentine hall, listening to an orator toast to the dignity of dairy. The host, a minor nobleman with major opinions about cheese. His title is something like Count of Curd, or at least that's what I call him in my head. His actual name is too long, too vowel-laden, and honestly, not nearly as memorable as the wedge of truffle-infused taleggio he just served me. Here's the thing. In Renaissance Italy, cheese wasn't just food, it was fashion. A symbol of taste, refinement, even class warfare. Think of it like the Renaissance version of Instagram-worthy avocado toast. Except here, instead of brunch, you're attending candlelit feasts where each course is a dairy sculpture. And instead of humble bragging online, nobles hired poets to describe the cheese in verse. I'm not joking. I've seen the manuscripts. Wealthy families treated their cheese like art collections. They built custom cabinets, cheese credenzas with velvet lining. They commissioned portraits featuring family members holding wheels like scepters. One Medici cousin even had a cameo made in the shape of a cow udder. Fashionable? Debatable. Memorable? Absolutely. At these events, cheese was presented in absurd, glorious form. Pyramids of grated Parmigiano dusted with gold, cheeses carved into busts of Roman philosophers, wheels hollowed and filled with warm mascarpone and candied figs. One dinner included a cheese fountain, into which guests dipped breadsticks while being serenaded by a lute trio. If I'd invented this in a dream, I'd say it was too much. But here, it's just Tuesday. Historians still argue whether these displays were sincere admiration or just decadent flexing. My guess? Both. Nothing says, I'm better than you, like serving cheese that costs more than your cousin's dowry. And believe me, those costs were wild. Some cheeses were infused with saffron, soaked in rare wines, or smoked over almond wood imported from distant colonies. The guests at this banquet are dressed like peacocks, ruffled collars, embroidered sleeves, velvet capes, and yet all eyes keep returning to the cheese. Not the musicians, not the dancers, the cheese. One old woman whispers reverently to a young boy beside her, that one aged for 9 summers. He nods solemnly, like she just pointed out the bones of a saint. Each noble family had its house cheese, often from a local dairy they patronized exclusively. These were fiercely protected. Rivalries emerged. Feuds erupted. One family reportedly refused to marry into another household because their pecorino lacked nobility. Petty? Absolutely. But this was a time when people still dueled over fruit arrangements. Speaking of duels, there was even a brief fad for cheese comparison contests, literal taste-offs, judged by panels of nobles, sometimes hosted in public squares. Winners were awarded gilded ladles, embroidered aprons, or, in one notable case, a small estate. Losers? Public shame, followed by the mandatory consumption of the winner's cheese, which, if we're honest, doesn't sound like the worst punishment. As I take another bite of soft, fragrant robiola drizzled with chestnut honey, I can't help but notice the servants. They move like dancers, gliding in synchronized lines, each bearing trays of cheese at exactly the right temperature and humidity. These people didn't wing it. They trained for this. One young man, clearly nervous, presents the next course with trembling hands. Robiola di Roccaverano, aged in straw, wrapped in chestnut leaves, he announces. The Count raises an eyebrow. But was it turned at the half moon? The servant blinks. I believe so, sir. The Count sniffs, unconvinced. He takes a bite anyway. Crisis averted. This obsession went beyond food. It became etiquette. There were rules. You couldn't just slice into a cheese any which way. Each type had its proper approach. Diagonal for firm cheeses, circular for soft ones, vertical for aged. Serve a sheep's milk cheese with the wrong bread, and someone might faint. Serve it too warm, and you'd be banished from the table. Maybe the country. The height of cheese-based status was having your own named cheese. Seriously, if a dairy in your region developed a new method or flavor, they might name it after your estate. That's how certain varieties spread, not from culinary genius, but from noble vanity. The Count of Curd himself, he of the golden robiola, once sponsored a local cheesemaker's experiment involving pine needles, goat milk, and 2 weeks of chanting monks. The result was Cashin Argento, silver cheese, a name whispered reverently around the table. I try it. It tastes like smoke, citrus, and quiet arrogance. Eventually, the feast winds down. The candles sputter. The musicians grow quiet. But no one leaves. Why? Because dessert is coming. And yes, it's cheese. Sweet ricotta flavored with rose water. Mascarpone folded with candied orange peel. A dish they call Formaggio del Stelle. Cheese of the stars. Soft cow's cheese infused with lavender and dusted with sugar, meant to be eaten under moonlight. As we nibble, someone reads a short cheese sonnet. I don't catch every word, but the final line sticks with me. I would trade heaven's bread for one more rind of home. It's cheesy, yes, pun fully intended, but also oddly touching. As I step out into the cool Florentine night, belly full, senses overloaded, I realize these people didn't just love cheese. They needed it. As comfort, as culture, as status, as story. Because in a world where everything could be stolen, burned, or broken, a wheel of cheese was something you could hold. Slice, share, brag about. And if you were lucky, you could write your name on the rind, and history might just remember you. I didn't think my nose would survive this next stop. I've smelled many things on this cheese journey. Some divine, some deeply questionable. But nothing prepared me for the noble family's aging cave in Piedmont. Picture this, a sprawling stone chamber beneath a villa, carved into the hillside centuries ago. The air is thick, cold, and impossibly pungent. It hits me the moment I step inside, a wall of scent that's equal parts mushroom, barnyard wet socks, and somehow regret. I gag. My eyes water. The guide, a very serious man named Giancarlo wearing a velvet waistcoat and a tiny silver nose ring, nods approvingly. That means the cheese is alive, he says. I believe him. Renaissance Italians had a thing for smells. They believed aromas could reveal moral character, spiritual health, even intelligence. And cheese? Cheese had layers of aroma, of meaning, of power. In some circles, the ability to endure a truly ripe cheese without flinching was a mark of elite refinement. One 15th century etiquette guide actually advises, do not recoil at the rind, for therein lies virtue. Bold statement, and misleading. The cheese aging in this cave isn't just old, it's ancient. Some wheels have been aging here since before Columbus left for the Americas. They sit on oaken shelves, wrapped in muslin, labeled in faded Latin with noble family crests and peculiar mottos like lux in lact, light in milk, and percisium veritas, through cheese truth. Apparently, each branch of the family commissioned their own house cheese. The smellier, the better. One particularly legendary blue-veined monstrosity was described by a visiting German scholar in 1498 as olfactorily violent. He wasn't exaggerating. I can smell its descendant from across the room. Giancarlo shows me a notebook passed down through generations. It contains detailed tasting notes, pairing suggestions, and, for some reason, 2 recipes for what he calls cheese perfume. I raise an eyebrow. Oh yes, he says proudly. Worn by nobility. Behind the ears. Historians still argue whether this was an actual fashion trend or just a bizarre family quirk. But several Renaissance portraits do show aristocrats holding or wearing small cloths scented with cheese rinds. Apparently, they believe the aroma symbolized rustic virility. Or maybe they just like to confuse guests. I take a cautious step toward one of the older wheels. Its rind is wrinkled, cracked, and vaguely green. That one, Giancarlo says, was made during the siege of Ferrara. I nod slowly. You don't eat that one, right? He laughs. You can, but only on family holidays. It's not just the cheese that's curated here. It's the entire sensory experience. Soft light filters through narrow windows. The stone floor is intentionally uneven, so each step is a meditative wobble. There's a faint, deliberate dripping sound from a nearby wall, an acoustic flourish added in the 1600s to encourage reflection. John Carlo tells me. These people didn't just age cheese, they composed it. And that brings me to an odd little corner of Renaissance culture, the belief that cheese could elevate the senses. Literally, in some noble households, cheese was consumed before reading poetry or listening to music, the way one might stretch before a run. There are documented accounts of scholars who claimed a well-aged caprino opened the ears or unlocked the tongue. One diary from 1482 details a bizarre experiment. A group of noblemen sampled different cheeses before delivering impromptu speeches. The winner, according to the notes, ate a goat's cheese so sharp it made the tongue dance. That's one way to prep for public speaking. Of course, not all noble cheese adventures ended well. One tale, equal parts tragedy and slapstick, involves a young heir who insisted on aging his own personal wheel in a sealed gold chamber. When it was finally opened, the smell allegedly caused 2 guests to faint and a dog to run away. I can't verify this, but I want it to be true. I take a small taste of one of John Carlo's family cheeses, something made with sheep milk, aged in hay, and brushed with wine must. The flavor is deep and earthy, with notes of caramel, leather, and, somehow, thunderstorm. I chew slowly. My vision tunnels briefly. This cheese has opinions. Back upstairs, the family dining room awaits. It's lined with portraits, ancestors painted with wheels of cheese in their laps or held aloft like trophies. One woman, stern-eyed and lace-collared, has an inscription beneath her that reads, "She aged well, like her cheese." Honestly, goals. What strikes me most is the pride. These cheeses aren't just food, they're legacy. They represent land, family, patience, obsession. They age in silence, gathering dust and stories, waiting for someone to taste and remember. And smell, of course. Always the smell. As I leave, John Carlo hands me a small wedge wrapped in linen. A gift, he says. Eat it when you need to remember something important. I don't ask what, because somehow I know. I wake up the next morning with a bit of a cheese hangover. Not the stomach kind. Though after that goat's milk thunderstorm wedge, anything's possible, but more of a sensory fatigue. My dreams were all curds and caves, family crests and moldy saints. I'm starting to think this journey is rewiring my brain chemistry. Which makes sense, because today, I'm diving into the strangest corner of the Renaissance cheese universe yet. Cheese as medicine. Yes, medicine. I'm in Bologna now, and I've been granted access to the archives of an old university apothecary. Shelves grown under jars of dried herbs, oils, powders, and, yes, chunks of hardened cheese. A student in a long robe and ink-stained sleeves hands me a worn copy of Trattato del Virtù Caesari, a treatise on the virtues of cheese. It's part pharmacology manual, part unhinged fanfiction. The author, a physician named Pietro Alfani, makes bold claims right out of the gate. Let it be known that cheese is both curative and divine. He wasn't alone in thinking this. Throughout the 15th and 16th centuries, cheese appeared in medical texts alongside poppy, myrrh, and powdered unicorn horn. According to these records, cheese could be used to treat fatigue, melancholy, indigestion, snakebite, gout, heartbreak, spiritual confusion, and in one ambitious entry, the common plague. Historians still argue whether doctors truly believed in cheese's healing powers or just ran out of other options. After all, this was an era when sneezing too loudly was cause for a leeching. But the treatments were detailed, very detailed. For stomach complaints, a spoonful of soft sheep's cheese mixed with mint and crushed almonds. For coughs, a broth made from aged Parmigiano grated into boiled wine. For anxiety, rub goat cheese onto the soles of your feet before bed. I have questions. There's also a long, frankly hilarious section about using cheese as a poultice. Pietro writes, "If the wound be shallow, a warm ricotta will draw the corruption out. I've stubbed my toe plenty of times, but not once have I thought, where's the ricotta? Some of these ideas came from older Greek and Roman texts, which Renaissance scholars love to recycle. Galen, the ancient physician, once suggested soft cheese could temper the humors. The Italians took this and ran. By the 1480s, people were treating everything from fevers to romantic rejection with cheese. In fact, one noblewoman famously claimed to have cured her homesickness with a daily dose of Tuscan pecorino. Her letters survive, and they're basically the Renaissance version of a wellness blog. My spirits lift with each nibble. I feel strong, whole, warm in the bones. Girl, same. But it wasn't just about eating it. Cheese appeared in rituals, too. In certain towns, it was traditional to place a wheel of cheese under a sick person's bed as a draw for bad air. The idea being that illness would absorb into the cheese instead of the body. Which is disgusting, yes, but it also led to a tradition of burning the infected cheese at town festivals. Imagine a smoky parade where villagers chant while torching a wheel of brie. That's not science. That's theater. Still, I can't entirely dismiss it, because there's something oddly comforting in the idea that cheese, with its calm weight and slow aging, could fix you. That it wasn't just food, but balm. As I thumb through more texts, I find marginal notes, little scribbles from past physicians and students. One reads, "Tested on uncle, works for stomach, not for foot." Another simply says, "Too stinky equals more effective." That one's underlined twice. The apothecary even kept a cheese cabinet next to his herbs. The cheeses were sorted by temperature, moisture, and age, like precious reagents. A logbook notes, 2 wheels used in childbirth ritual. 1 eaten, 1 buried. I didn't know whether to laugh or faint. Oh, and yes, there's a record of monks mixing grated cheese into sacramental wine to treat moral fatigue. I don't know what moral fatigue is, but if cheese and wine can cure it, I think we all suffer from it occasionally. By midday, I've compiled a list of the top 5 Renaissance cheese cures. The lung lozenge, Parmesan aged in honey, slowly chewed for persistent coughs. The night pad, goat cheese wrapped in cloth, applied to the chest before sleep. The wound clotter, fresh curds pressed into shallow cuts, then bandaged. The guilt tonic, ricotta and lemon stirred into warm milk, served after confession. The dream softener, blue cheese placed under the pillow to encourage peaceful visions. I try none of these, but I do sneak a bite of a 24-month Parmigiano sitting on the shelf. It tastes like wood smoke and old stories. Somehow, I feel better immediately. Placebo? Maybe. Miracle? Also maybe. By the time I step outside, the sun is starting to dip behind Bologna's terracotta rooftops. The air smells faintly of rosemary and roasted chestnuts. My mind buzzes with recipes, remedies, and the sheer absurdity of Renaissance wellness culture. But also, a weird amount of admiration. Because behind all the superstition and moldy poultices was a deeper truth. They were trying to feel better, trying to understand their bodies, trying to treat their wounds, physical or otherwise, with what they had. And what they had was cheese. I walked back toward my inn, a soft wedge of ricotta wrapped in linen tucked under my arm like a comfort animal. Tomorrow I'll head to Rome. But tonight, I'm going to smear this on toast, sip something warm, and heal the old-fashioned way. Rome, the eternal city, a place of saints, senators, scaffolding, and, somehow, cheese guilds. I didn't come here expecting bureaucracy, but the Renaissance had a knack for turning everything, even dairy, into an institution. And so, this morning, I find myself climbing the marble steps of a 16th century building that once housed the Confraternita del Cassio Romano, the Brotherhood of Roman Cheese. I kid you not. These were actual registered guilds. Official. Organized. Proud. Imagine your local chamber of commerce. But every member smells faintly of pecorino and wears robes embroidered with little sheep. That's what I've walked into. Guilds like this existed all over Italy. In Florence, in Milan, in Venice. But Rome's was special. Because here, cheese wasn't just food. It was law, trade, and morality all folded into one bureaucratic wheel. They kept records. They enforced quality. They even fined members for unjust fermentation. I don't even know what that means, but it sounds serious. The archivist, a gentleman named Vittorio with a lazy eye and a very enthusiastic mustache, shows me the old guild ledger. It's massive, leather-bound, and smells like dust and dairy. Inside are lists of members, cheese taxes, sanctioned producers, and a truly bizarre page titled Offenses of Note. I read it aloud. March 1494. Lorenzo de Pietra fined for excessive Rhine hoarding. June 1501. Julia Fontana reprimanded for public disrespect of sheep. October 1507. Guild member unknown brought shame upon the Brotherhood by bringing French cheese to a guild dinner. Expelled. Historians still argue whether these rules were strictly enforced or more symbolic. Personally, I like to imagine a tiny Renaissance courtroom where someone has to solemnly defend their cheese before a jury of peers in powdered wigs and aprons. These guilds weren't just about pride. They protected livelihoods. A good cheese reputation meant survival. If someone sold underaged, sour, or fake cheese, they risked more than just an unhappy customer. They could be banned from markets, lose their stall, or even be exiled from the city. That's right, exile, for cheese crimes. But the guilds also fostered innovation. They funded experiments, different milks, herbs, curing methods. They published treatises and hosted festivals. They even sponsored poetry contests. One surviving poem from 1510 opens with the line, "O Pecorino, thou sun-age delight, thy scent stings more sweetly than love." Honestly, if someone wrote that for me, I'd propose. I asked Vittorio if the guild still exists. He grins. "Only as legend," he says. "But some of us keep the minutes, just in case." He winks. I think he's only half joking. From the guild house, I wander through the old markets near Campo de' Fiori, imagining what it must have been like 500 years ago. The air thick with the calls of vendors, clanging scales, the slap of bread crusts, the occasional goat on a leash. Cheese was displayed proudly, on marble slabs, wrapped in linen, dangling from hooks. One traveler described a Roman market as a place where even the air was salted. I stop at a modern stall still run by descendants of a Renaissance cheese family. The woman behind the counter hands me a piece of aged Casio and says, "This is the same recipe our ancestors used in 1472. I taste it. Sharp, salty, dry as parchment, and totally addictive. She tells me her great-great-great something grandfather once paid his rent in cheese. Honestly, not the worst financial system. And that's the other thing. Cheese was currency, especially in Rome, where everything from rent to bribes to priestly favors could be negotiated with wheels of dairy. Need a stonecutter to fix your steps? That'll be half a sheep and a wedge of pecorino. Want a marriage annulled? Well, let's see how old your Parmesan is. Some papal guards were even partly compensated in cheese. One letter from a bishop to the Vatican treasurer requests a monthly stipend in coin, plus 2 wheels of Tuscan cow's milk cheese for the preservation of morale. Honestly, same. I sit at a fountain and nibble on a bite of cheese I bought with €3 and a grin. It occurs to me that for all our modern obsession with money, the Renaissance Italians understood something we've mostly forgotten. Value can be measured in comfort, in craftsmanship, in something that takes time and intention to create. Cheese wasn't just sustenance. It was a unit of trust, a symbol of reliability. You don't spend 3 years aging something unless you plan to stick around. As the sun dips behind a nearby dome, I hear church bells echoing through the city. I close my eyes and imagine them not as a call to prayer, but as a cheese auction bell ringing across the square. Men in doublets shouting bids. Women in embroidered veils examining rinds. A monk in the corner doing quality control with his nose. And somewhere in the crowd, a guild scribe is jotting it all down, just in case someone someday wants to remember how seriously we once took cheese. I do. I want to remember, because it's not ridiculous. It's Roman. The further south I travel, the funkier the cheeses get. And I mean that in every sense, aroma, texture, and attitude. I'm now in the shadow of Naples, where volcanic soil feeds grass that feeds sheep that, according to one farmer, carry the fire of Vesuvius in their milk. A dramatic claim, but then again, this is Italy. Here, cheese isn't just food. It's a personality test. I'm visiting a rural dairy just outside the city, where a man named Enzo welcomes me with a handshake so firm it nearly separates my arm from its socket. "We don't do soft here," he says, leading me toward his barn, except in the middle of the cheese. He's not wrong. The specialty here is Provolone del Monaco, Provolone of the Monk, a semi-hard cheese with a tender, gooey heart if aged just right. The name is misleading, no monks involved. The story goes that the cheese was carried by shepherds into Naples wearing cloaks that looked vaguely monastic, and the name stuck. Renaissance marketing at its finest. What fascinates me is how regional cheese in southern Italy wasn't just different in taste, but in status. While northern Italian cheeses were showing up on noble tables, southern cheeses remained fiercely rustic, proudly coarse. This wasn't the cheese of courtly banquets. It was the cheese of people who worked with their hands, sweated through linen shirts, and sometimes fought over goats. Enzo lets me taste one of his latest batches. It's sharp, dense, and slightly spicy, with a smell that's best described as bold confidence. He watches my face carefully. I nod. He nods. This is a serious business transaction. During the Renaissance, he says, pulling down a dusty scroll, my grandfather's grandfather's grandfathers. Well, you get the idea. He paid his tax with this cheese. The scroll details local cheese tithes from the late 1400s, listing precisely how many wheels each family owed the feudal lord. Enzo points proudly to his ancestor's name, Michel di Latte, literally Michael of Milk. Honestly, I can't top that. What's surprising is how detailed these tax records are. Not just quantity, but weight, age, and even quality. Bad cheese, extra fees. Good cheese, discounted rates. It was like a Yelp review system, but enforced by men with swords. Historians still argue whether these cheese taxes were meant to punish, encourage excellence, or just ensure the Lord had a solid snack supply. I'm voting for all three. We walk to his aging cave, a cool stone chamber dug directly into the hillside. The walls are moist, the air heavy with what I can only describe as agricultural suspense. Dozens of provolone wheels hang from ropes tied to the ceiling, swinging gently as if breathing. He pulls one down, knocks on it like it's a watermelon, and slices it open with a short, curved knife. Steam, actual steam, wafts out. That's the spirit leaving, he jokes. I laugh nervously, half convinced he means it. Southern cheese lore is full of these mystical flourishes. Legends of cheeses that can heal wounds, seduce enemies, summon rain. One tale I hear in town tells of a young woman who won a husband's heart by aging Cavallo in her hope chest. He married her, the old man says, but truly he loved the cheese. Fair enough. I find an old poem in the local archives, written in 1493, that compares southern cheese to a volcano, firm outside, with fire within. It's oddly sensual, possibly unintentional. Unlike the North, where cheese had become elegant and competitive, southern Italy kept it rough. Farmers aged wheels in clay pots, or buried them in straw, or hung them from olive trees. They didn't write treatises. They passed recipes down in gossip, jokes, and hands-on demonstrations. Cheese knowledge here was as much physical muscle memory as it was science. And yet, even in this earthy world, cheese was identity. One small town I visit still holds an annual cheese rolling contest, a tradition dating back to the Renaissance, when locals would compete to see whose wheel rolled furthest down a hill without cracking. The winner was declared the Duke of Dairy for a day. I watched this year's contest from a slope crowded with cheering, cheese-hurling enthusiasts. One wheel crashes into a fence. Another bounces clean over a dog. Everyone applauds. The winner's prize? More cheese. Enzo tells me southern cheese was often ridiculed by northerners. Too rough, too smelly, too common. But ironically, these very qualities made it thrive. Southern cheese didn't rely on noble approval or fancy trade routes. It was made to last, to feed, to mean something. And now, It's having the last laugh. Some of the world's most sought-after cheeses, like mozzarella di bufala and aged Cavallo, come from here. Built not in royal kitchens, but in smoky barns and sun-bleached fields. As the sun sets over the orchard behind Enzo's house, he slices a piece of cheese, hands it to me, and says, "This one's made the way my great-grandfather taught me. You eat it slowly or not at all." I chew, slowly, and I realize Southern Renaissance cheese wasn't just about survival. It was about resilience, about flavor born from fire, from patience, from the need to carve meaning out of milk, time, and sweat. Not fancy, not noble, but unforgettable. Somewhere between Naples and Bari, on a rickety carriage road that should have been retired in 1478, I hit a cheese detour that no map warns about. The legend of the cheese prophet. Yes, that's a real thing. The town is tiny, barely more than a cluster of stone houses with red tile roofs and windows overflowing with basil. I'm there to follow up on a local historian's letter referencing, a man who spoke only in dairy metaphors and was considered divinely touched. Sounds promising. I arrived during siesta hour, which means the streets are quiet and every door is slightly ajar, but guarded by suspicious cats. Eventually, I find the town's archivist, a sprightly woman named Julia, who leads me into what looks like a converted wine cellar, but turns out to be a community museum entirely dedicated to San Formaggio. That's right, Saint Cheese. Now, technically, he was never canonized. The church has no record of him. But for 500 years, the locals have insisted that a 15th century shepherd named Matteo experienced visions delivered through wheels of cheese. The story goes something like this. Matteo was a quiet man, good with sheep, better with milk. One summer, after days of fasting and stress-churning curds in a heat wave, he fell asleep next to his cheese cave and awoke claiming to have received a message. From what? Unclear. But the message was simple: age with purpose. He began delivering prophecies, always while holding cheese. The rains will come after the pecorino softens. Your daughter will marry when the mold forms evenly. Trust the cheese. If it cracks, so will the peace. People thought he was mad. Then his predictions started coming true. And then things got weird. He insisted on baptizing infants with whey. He blessed marriages with cheesecloth. He built a small shrine entirely out of stacked wheels and insisted no one move them or the harvest would fail. One time, he walked barefoot across a field of ricotta and declared it sacred ground. Historians still argue whether Matteo was a sincere mystic, a master of fermentation, or just deeply lactose delirious. Regardless, the locals loved him. His cheeses sold for 10 times the norm. His advice was sought by farmers, lovers, even a few curious bishops. One tale says a nobleman rode 2 days to hear Matteo's opinion on a troubled treaty. Matteo told him, "Add sheep's milk. It balances better." The nobleman took this as metaphor. The treaty held. Today, the museum preserves several of his personal belongings: a gnarled wooden stirring spoon, a leather pouch with what may or may not be sacred mold, and a small wheel of cheese sealed in wax with a label that reads, "Do not open until the moon weeps." No one knows what that means. Everyone's afraid to find out. Julia leads me to a mural painted in 1523. Matteo, surrounded by villagers, rays of light emanating from a wheel of cheese in his arms. His eyes are half closed. He looks serene, slightly bloated, deeply mysterious. The funny thing? There's science that backs up the idea that certain molds can trigger hallucinations, especially when combined with fasting and heat exhaustion. So maybe Matteo wasn't crazy. Maybe he was just extremely committed. Regardless, he left a legacy. After his death, the townspeople created the Festival of the Blessed Rind. Every spring, they roll massive wheels of cheese through the streets, light candles in the aging cellars, and wear necklaces made of braided cheese strings. They chant his sayings. They sing hymns. They drink warmed whey with honey and pepper. And yes, they still whisper prayers over their cheese. Age with purpose. Crack not. Let the mold be holy. I sit at the evening celebration, lanterns swinging in the breeze, music plinking on mandolins, and share a plate of Mateo-style cheese. Raw milk, lightly aged, seasoned with rosemary and thyme. It's creamy, herby, faintly wild. I close my eyes. The crowd is laughing. A man near me tells a story about his grandfather hiding a wheel of cheese under his bed for luck. Another woman swears she dreamed of Mateo before her wedding, and her mozzarella never curdled since. I can't explain it, but I believe them, because cheese is slow. It listens, it absorbs, it changes, and maybe, just maybe it remembers. That's the secret, isn't it? In a world of war, famine, superstition, and splinters, cheese was dependable, predictable. It followed rules. If you were patient, precise, faithful, the cheese would reward you. Maybe not with visions, maybe just with dinner. But in the Renaissance, that was miracle enough. Before I leave, Julia presses something into my hand, a ribbon of cheesecloth and a tiny medallion with Mateo's face on it. "Keep it near your fridge," she whispers. "It wards off spoilage." I thank her. I don't laugh. I'm way too deep for that now. Outside, the moon rises slowly over the rooftops. The scent of toasted rind lingers in the air. I walk past a shrine where a small wheel of cheese sits nestled in candles, steaming slightly under the heat. Someone's left a note beside it that says, simply, "Please let the sheep come home." And in that moment, I understand exactly why people once wrote entire books about cheese. Because it fed their hopes as much as their stomachs. By the time I reach Pienza, I'm convinced cheese has more political history than most royal families. Nestled in the hills of Tuscany, this postcard-perfect town is famous for pecorino. Specifically, pecorino di Pienza, a sheep's milk cheese that tastes like salted velvet and smells like a barn that's been blessed by angels. But what most people don't know is that Pienza was once the epicenter of a very Renaissance power move involving dairy, diplomacy, and an ambitious pope with excellent taste. Let me explain. Pope Pius II, born Ignazio Silvio Piccolomini, was a native of Pienza back when it was still a sleepy village called Corsignano. After ascending to the papacy in the mid-15th century, he decided he wanted his hometown to reflect his new status. So he did what any modest religious leader would do. He had it entirely rebuilt into a model Renaissance city, complete with palaces, piazzas, and, yes, a cheese market at the center. Urban beautification, he called it. Branding, I call it. This wasn't just about architecture, it was about identity. Pope Pius wanted his city to be known not just for holiness, but for excellence. And cheese, already beloved by the locals, was promoted as a symbol of that excellence. He encouraged local farmers to refine their methods. He funded improvements to aging caves. He even, get this, wrote a short ode to pecorino in one of his personal letters, describing it as divinely pungent. Historians still argue whether the Pope's cheese enthusiasm was sincere or simply a clever PR stunt. But either way, it worked. Word spread. Merchants arrived. Pilgrims came not just for the papal blessing, but for a slice of spicy pecorino wrapped in walnut leaves. And here's the kicker. Pienza's cheese actually became part of papal diplomacy. I found a document in the town archives, a shipping log from 1460 detailing wheels of pecorino sent from Pienza to foreign courts. France, Aragon, the Holy Roman Empire. Each wheel labeled with the papal seal, wrapped in velvet, and accompanied by a note that basically said, "Blessings and dairy from His Holiness." Imagine the Pope's envoy showing up to the King of Hungary's court with a cheese wheel instead of cross. "May the Lord be with you, and may this rind age in peace." Of course, this kind of cheese as soft power wasn't limited to popes. All over Renaissance Italy, rulers used regional cheeses as calling cards. Cheese conveyed wealth, culture, land, and, most importantly, control over time. Because aging a good cheese took patience, stability, and trust. If you could manage a cheese cave, the logic went, maybe you could manage a country. I walked through the streets of Pienza, past storefronts piled high with wheels of every size, some aged in ash, some in grape must, some embedded with black truffles like edible jewelry. The shopkeepers slice samples with reverence. describing textures like they're reciting poetry. One piece is firm like stone, but tastes of green wheat and firewood. Another is soft, weeping slightly, with the scent of thunder. Yes, cheese in Tuscany weeps. You get used to it. There's even a small church where a stained glass window includes a sheep holding a banner that reads, "Behold the milk of peace." I assumed this was a metaphor. I hope it was a metaphor. I meet an old cheesemaker named Carlo, whose family has lived here since the days of Pope Pius. He shows me his private cave, carved into the hillside, cool and quiet as a library. Dozens of Pecorino wheels rest on wooden shelves, labeled with chalk markings that look more like spells than inventory. He tells me, every cheese is a letter. You send it into the future, and you wait for an answer. I ask if he's ever had a bad answer. He shrugs. Sometimes the rind cracks. That's just how the story ends. There's a humility to this practice that I hadn't expected. We tend to think of Renaissance grandeur as towering cathedrals and gold leaf frescoes, but down here, in the dark stone caves of Pienza, greatness is round, waxy, and aging slowly in silence. One of the most fascinating tidbits I uncover comes from a 1474 journal entry. A local bishop requested that each new priest ordained in Pienza receive a Wheel of the Year's finest Pecorino as a reminder to grow wise, not stale. I can't think of a better ordination gift or life lesson, honestly. Later that evening, as the sun softens the brick walls to rose and the valley glows with golden haze, I sit on the cathedral steps eating a hunk of pecorino aged in olive leaves. It tastes like earth, brine, and memory. People pass by, some nodding in approval, some pausing to ask where I got that particular slice. A group of teenagers are filming a TikTok about the cheese pope, and one of them dramatically narrates, he was just a man with a dream and a dairy-based diplomacy strategy. I love this country because what I've realized is cheese was never just about flavor. It was about trust, about stability, about showing the world that something grown from the earth, aged with care, and shared generously could represent who you were. And if a pope thought that was important enough to build a whole city around it, maybe he was onto something. It's not every day you find yourself staring at a fresco of the Last Supper where Jesus is unmistakably holding a wedge of cheese. I'm in a quiet monastery outside Arezzo, Tuscany, and Brother Luca, a wiry monk with a suspiciously good sense of comic timing, is giving me the grand tour. He waves his hand toward the faded painting on the dining hall wall and says that was added by Brother Giovanni in 1492. He believed heaven would absolutely include cheese. I nod solemnly. I see no heresy here. Religion and cheese might seem like an odd couple, but in Renaissance Italy, they were practically married. From monasteries to pilgrimages to dietary laws, cheese played a surprisingly spiritual role in everyday life, and often ended up right in the center of theological debate. Let's start with fasting. The church had strict rules about what could be eaten during religious fasting periods. No meat, no animal fats. But dairy? That was murky. Some monasteries allowed cheese, especially if it came from animals considered lower on the divine ladder, sorry goats. Others forbade it entirely, and still others, well, they found loopholes. One document I find in the monastery library is a 1487 letter from an abbot justifying the inclusion of cheese during Lent. His argument? Cheese is not flesh, but a spiritual condensation of pasture. Bold. Also, suspiciously poetic. Historians still argue whether this was sincere theology or just monks being clever to keep their snack supply flowing. I'm voting for both, because while many monks lived simply, they also happened to be among the best cheesemakers in Italy. Their devotion to discipline made them perfect artisans, patient, observant, methodical, and their isolation gave them the time and space to experiment. Brother Luca leads me down a narrow staircase into the monastery's ancient cheese cellar. It's dim and cool, and the air smells like eternity. Dozens of small, firm wheels sit on wooden racks, each marked with a tiny cross burned into the rind. We don't sell these, he says. They're for visitors, celebrations, and the sick. I ask if they still follow Renaissance recipes. He smiles. We are the recipe. Apparently, each generation of monks passes down cheese techniques by hand. No written instructions, just whispers in the early morning hours over steaming milk. It feels like a secret society of dairy alchemists. And in a way it is. Back in the main hall, I leaf through old monastery records. One monk's notes from 1495 read, like a prayer journal with cheese commentary inserted. Matins today was peaceful. Brother Paolo sings off-key. The evening cheese needs more salt. Another entry, dated Easter Sunday, simply says, Christ is risen. The curd did not. There's also a section of Psalms translated into cheese metaphors. My favorite. As the Lord separates the curd from the whey, so too does he guide us from folly. It wasn't just monks, though. Pilgrims traveling to Rome or Santiago de Compostela often carried cheese in their satchels. It was durable, portable, and symbolic. Many churches along the way offered cheese as part of their hospitality. Aged wheels as sustenance for the soul as much as the stomach. One 15th century pilgrimage diary refers to cheese as the wheel of divine favor. There are even accounts of pilgrims making cheese offerings, leaving small wheels at altars in thanks for safe passage. Some towns kept these wheels as relics. Others, more practically, used them to feed the poor. Either way, cheese and faith were intertwined. One particularly quirky story comes from a convent in Siena, where the nuns reportedly created a special cheese wheel infused with rose petals and olive oil, called Fiori di Grazia, flower of grace. It was only made once a year during a secret midnight mass, and was believed to encourage lucid dreams. I would very much like to try this cheese. And of course, there's the persistent legend that Saint Catherine of Bologna's body, still on display in a seated position in a glass case, smelled faintly of aged cheese when first exhumed. People took it as a sign of holiness, or hunger, or both. Brother Luca and I sit down for a simple meal, bread, olives, and slices of their signature cheese, nutty, dry, and astonishingly complex for something made with only 3 ingredients. He tells me, we don't rush it. The curd decides when it's ready. I ask if he believes cheese has a spiritual quality. He shrugs. I believe God made it hard to make, but easy to love. That sounds like a blessing to me. As the monastery bell rings and the day folds gently into dusk, I reflect on how even in the most sacred corners of Renaissance life, cheese found a place. It slipped through theological debates, nestled into ritual, softened the harshness of fasting, and offered comfort to travelers of the spirit and body alike. Because if faith is about patience, practice, and trust in the invisible, then so is cheese. And maybe that's why they go so well together. It's funny how something as humble as cheese can lead you straight into a war room. Okay, maybe war room is a stretch, but the palazzo I'm visiting today in Mantua once hosted dukes, generals, and ambassadors, and at the center of it all, cheese. Specifically, cheese diplomacy. I'm here to investigate a lesser-known but deeply entertaining chapter of Renaissance history. How city-states used cheese as a bargaining chip, sometimes literally, in the high-stakes game of Italian politics. Let's set the scene. It's the late 15th century. Italy isn't one country yet. It's a tangle of fiercely independent city-states. Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, the Papal States, all constantly vying for territory, trade routes, and influence. Alliances form and shatter like Parmesan under pressure. And amidst all the gold, silk, and threats enter cheese. In Mantua, I'm shown an archive room with velvet curtains and a chandelier shaped like a bunch of grapes. The archivist, Elena, pulls out a collection of diplomatic correspondence from the Gonzaga family, local rulers known for their flair and appetite. One letter from 1491 catches my eye. It's from a Gonzaga ambassador in Ferrara, and it includes a shopping list. 2 barrels of sweet wine, 4 bolts of Florentine linen, and 3 wheels of Parmigiano of the boldest flavor for softening Duke Ercoli's tone. Yes, they were literally using cheese to win over rivals. Historians still argue whether this sort of gift-giving was strategic generosity or a form of delicious bribery. But either way, it worked. Renaissance etiquette required nobles to reciprocate gifts. And once you gave someone cheese, they kind of had to like you. Or at least eat what you gave them. There's even a documented cheese détente in 1503, when a minor conflict between two Tuscan towns was resolved by exchanging aging techniques instead of soldiers. A symbolic act, yes, but one that helped prevent bloodshed. That's right, cheese saved lives. And if that's not weird enough for you, try this. In 1488, a Venetian envoy visiting Milan refused to eat a platter of soft cheese presented at a banquet. The slight was so severe that the host accused him of cultural insult and stormed out. Negotiations were delayed by 3 weeks. The cheese, tragically, was left untouched. Back in Mantua, Elena shows me an inventory list from a diplomatic banquet held in 1496. There were 18 varieties of cheese, each labeled with origin, age, and emotional intent. One, a soft sheep's cheese from Umbria, was described as humble yet flattering. Another, a sharp gorgonzola, was assertive without hostility. I start imagining what modern diplomats would accomplish if they had to explain their motives through dairy. Secretary of State arrives with 2-year aged cheddar. Robust, grounded, open to partnerships. But beyond the politics, there's something genuinely touching about how cheese operated as a symbol of peace. You can't make good cheese in chaos. It requires stability, both environmental and political. So when one region shared its cheese with another, it wasn't just food, it was a kind of message. We're calm. We're capable. We want something lasting. And it went both ways. Receiving cheese was seen as a compliment, an acknowledgement of refinement. The Duke of Milan once thanked the Doge of Venice for a wheel of piquant Montejo with the phrase, "Its bite was sharp, but its arrival softened my suspicions." Now that's diplomacy. There's even a story, possibly apocryphal, but too good not to share, about a secret meeting in 1492 between rival nobles that took place inside a massive cheese aging cellar. Neutral territory, because no one wanted to fight around wheels worth a small fortune. The peace talks were brief, but productive, and legend says the final agreement was sealed by both men dipping bread into the same pot of melted cheese. A literal fondue accord. Outside the archives, I take a walk through the quiet piazza. Mantua is calm these days, its cobblestones sun-warmed and dotted with cafe chairs. I sit at one and order a tasting plate of regional cheeses. The waiter nods approvingly, like I've just made a wise political move. As I chew thoughtfully on a slice of aged provolone with truffle, I think about how, in an era of poison rings and whispering courtiers, cheese offered something rare: honesty. You couldn't fake good cheese. You either knew how to make it or you didn't. And if you gave it as a gift, it meant something. A cheese will could mean, "We respect your palate. We admire your patience. We'd like to not stab each other over that border town." In short, it was edible diplomacy, a savory handshake. And while swords and treaties may have made the headlines, it's possible, just possible, that cheese made the peace. So I raise my little fork in a quiet toast to the unsung heroes of Renaissance foreign policy. The cheesemakers, the couriers, the culinary charmers who turned flavor into friendship. Because honestly, that's the kind of world I'd like to live in. There's something oddly satisfying about watching a block of cheese being used as a form of public shame. I've arrived in Bologna, and today I'm digging into the peculiar world of Renaissance cheese punishments. Yes, cheese could get you fined, banished, or, in truly dramatic cases, lightly humiliated in front of your neighbors. Italy, after all, doesn't do things halfway, not even its justice system. The first clue comes from a 1482 Civic record labeled, in delicate calligraphy, "Offense, dairy misrepresentation." Apparently, a merchant named Luca attempted to pass off subpar cheese, poorly aged, incorrectly labeled, and worst of all, made with a suspicious ratio of cow's milk to what should have been pure sheep's milk. A city inspector caught him mid-sale, and the punishment? A public apology, while standing barefoot on a wooden crate, holding the offending cheese over his head and reciting, "This curd is not what I claimed." I snort audibly in the archive room. The historian beside me, Serafina, who has the mischievous grin of someone who's seen too many cheese crimes, hands me more examples. There's the case of Benedetta, a noblewoman caught hoarding sacred market cheese during a famine. Her sentence? A fine and a full day spent giving away cheese in the town square while wearing a sash that read "too rich to share," now forced to care. Another merchant was caught using counterfeit rinds, essentially scraping off mold from higher quality wheels and applying it to inferior ones to pass them off as aged delicacies. His punishment involved scrubbing mold off public walls under guard supervision. Serafina calls it fungal community service. Historians still argue whether these punishments were legal code, theatrical warnings, or just deeply Italian performance art. But they were real and surprisingly effective. Public shame, it turns out, has a longer shelf life than most dairy products. I asked Serafina how officials even knew when cheese was fraudulent. She explains there were cheese inspectors, men trained to recognize smell, texture, and even the particular way a rind cracked. Some were former cheesemakers. Others were hired for their exceptionally sensitive noses. One even wrote a manual in 1490 titled How to Sniff Truth. I now want this tattooed on something. These inspectors weren't just hired hands. They had power. They could revoke market privileges, impose fines, or demand a will be destroyed on the spot. And that's where things got dramatic. Public cheese smashings were common, performed with ceremonial hammers, in front of cheering crowds, sometimes accompanied by a small musical flourish. Bologna even had a plaza corner nicknamed L'Angolo del Casio Sbagliato, the corner of wrong cheese. There's something wonderfully absurd about all of this. In a society often teetering between plague, invasion, and bad plumbing, people still made time to enforce dairy integrity with pageantry. But it wasn't just about snobbery, it was about trust. Cheese was daily nourishment. People didn't eat it for fun. They relied on it for calories, health, and survival. Selling fake cheese wasn't just dishonest, it was dangerous. It broke social contracts. It violated the rhythm of a community that had to believe in the consistency of its food to keep functioning. And it wasn't just the vendors who got in trouble. One record from 1497 shows a priest being reprimanded for blessing counterfeit cheese at a harvest festival. The punishment? He had to bless the entire cheese market every week for a month, publicly and sincerely. That's a lot of holy dairy. Another case details a teenage boy who snuck into an aging cave to sample the progress of several wheels. When caught, he was sentenced to write an apology poem in Latin about the importance of delayed gratification. The last line reads, "From curd to crust, time earns trust." Honestly, a plus. What fascinates me most is how cheese punishment often had a restorative element. It wasn't just about disgrace, it was about rebalancing. Give back what you took. Own your curd crimes. Share the good stuff with your neighbors. This all culminated, Serafina tells me, in an annual event held each spring called the Festa della Giustizia del Casio, Cheese Justice Festival. People gathered in the city square, where the year's worst dairy offenders were paraded out, and their offenses were read aloud by the local magistrate. They weren't jailed, they were educated, publicly, often with musical accompaniment. Then came the redemption phase. Each offender presented a wheel of cheese they had made, this time correctly. If the crowd approved, they were forgiven. If not, the wheel was sliced and handed out anyway. No good cheese goes to waste. I sit that evening in a quiet trattoria near the university, my head full of medieval trial scenes and cheese-based moral reckonings. I order a plate of local aged robiola, and as the waiter sets it down, I find myself inspecting it more closely than usual. Texture, firm, slightly spongy. Color, ivory with a hint of golden sun. Smell, clean, buttery, faint suggestion of hay. Would it pass the cheese tribunal of 1492? Absolutely. And as I savor each bite, I realize something deeper. Enforcing cheese integrity wasn't just about the cheese. It was about the community behind it. The idea that even the smallest traditions matter. That food is shared truth. And that sometimes a public apology, and a really good wheel of pecorino can bring everyone back into balance. Cheese wasn't above the law. It was the law. It's hard to describe the feeling of walking into a room and realizing that every single wall is covered in cheese recipes from the 1400s. Welcome to Florence. Or more specifically, welcome to the private collection of Signora Beatrice Rossi, historian, archivist, and, as she casually puts it, enthusiast of cheese literature. She greets me at her apartment in a quiet Florentine alleyway, wearing a scarf that appears to be patterned with miniature wheels of pecorino. I already trust her completely. What she shows me is astounding. Renaissance cookbooks, household manuals, merchant ledgers, and travel diaries, all obsessed with cheese. Neatly stacked on polished oak shelves, every one of them scribbled with marginal notes, corrections, tiny grease spots, and in one case, a faint doodle of a cow in a bishop's hat. We sit at her massive wooden table, sipping espresso and flipping through one particular gem, a 1476 household book titled Delizia di Latte, or Delights of Milk. It's handwritten in looping ink, peppered with recipes and instructions like, for cheese to soothe heartbreak, mix sheep's milk with rose water, wrap in vine leaves, and age in silence. Honestly, I buy that at Whole Foods. Florence during the Renaissance wasn't just a center of art and banking. It was a center of domestic experimentation. And cheese? Cheese was the star of the kitchen. These books weren't casual. They were serious culinary texts designed for noble households. Owning one was a status symbol. Writing one? A quiet kind of power. One author, Maria D'Andrea, included over 40 cheese-based dishes in her 1489 volume, many of which began with phrases like, "Only when the moon is new," or "If the goat has been calm this week." Cooking, I learned, was not just science. It was intuition, ritual, even astrology. Historians still argue whether these instructions were superstitions or encoded wisdom based on observation. Some modern cheesemakers swear there's a real difference in cur behavior depending on moon phase. Others just nod politely and keep stirring. Beatrice points to a recurring theme in these texts: cheese as comfort. It's not just about sustenance, it's about memory, about feeling safe. Recipes were deeply personal. One widow annotated her cheese pie recipe with, "Giorgio liked this on sad days." Another note reads, "Do not use this milk again. The cow was nervous." I read a passage from a diary written by a Florentine merchant's wife, dated 1493. The twins were fussy today. I fed them ricotta sweetened with honey and orange peel. They smiled. The day softened. That might be the most beautiful sentence I've ever read about dairy. But what's really fascinating is how cheese recipes in Renaissance Florence reflected social structure. Rich families could afford imported spices, complex baking methods, even gold leaf garnishes on cheese tarts. Poorer households relied on simpler methods: salt curing, sun drying, pressing curds under stones. But the creativity was no less impressive. One book contains a recipe for cheese broth made with stale bread, aged pecorino, herbs, and water boiled in a copper kettle. It was meant to stretch food during lean times. But the author includes a note: best served with hope and shared spoons. I'm not crying. You're crying. Beatrice shows me another treasure: cheese remedies. Renaissance households didn't just cook with cheese, they healed with it. There's a poultice recipe made from warm ricotta and crushed chamomile for chest pain. Another entry claims grated Parmesan can revive the weary if stirred into red wine. Honestly, worth a shot. And then there are the cheese customs, rules and etiquette around serving and eating cheese. Did you know that in some Florentine circles, it was considered rude to cut a cheese wheel in silence? Conversation was required, even if it was just, "Your rind is most agreeable." One host manual warns, "A dinner without cheese is a day without sun, but a guest who eats in silence is a cloud." Apparently, the right way to present cheese involved arranging slices in a spiral, with herbs tucked between them to ward off jealousy. At weddings, brides were sometimes gifted small cheese wheels for the health of the union. And on feast days, children carried cheese wreaths through the streets. Yes, actual wheels of cheese braided with ribbons and leaves. You can't make this stuff up. And I don't have to. It's all right there in the books. Before I leave, Beatrice gives me a thin volume bound in soft leather. It's a facsimile of her favorite recipes from the era, hand-transcribed. On the first page, she's written, "For moments when the world feels sharp, soft cheese and soft voices." Outside, Florence is buzzing. Tourists chatter. Vendors shout. Scooters buzz past at unlawful speeds. But I carry that little book under my arm like a secret. Because in Renaissance Florence, cheese wasn't just an ingredient. It was poetry. It was personality. It was what made a house a home. And honestly, I think we've all underestimated the emotional power of a good cheese tart. Somewhere along the winding lanes of Parma, I begin to hear whispers of something sacred. Less a cheese, more religion. Locals speak of it with reverence. Tourists try to pronounce it correctly. And, I prepare myself emotionally. Because today, I've come to witness the making of Parmigiano Reggiano. You know it. I know it. Your pasta definitely knows it. But in Renaissance Italy, this wasn't just a topping. It was a symbol of precision, prestige, and permanence. And if cheese could ever be treated like gold, this was it. I arrive just before dawn at a small caseificio outside Parma. It's misty, quiet, and smells faintly like warm milk and holy determination. The cheesemaker, Alberto, waves me in with one hand while the other stirs a massive copper vat filled with curdled milk and steam. It's hypnotic, like watching someone churn time itself. This is the same method, he says proudly, as we've done for 700 years. He's not exaggerating. Documents from the 13th and 14th centuries already describe Formaggio di Parma being aged, traded, gifted, even taxed. But during the Renaissance, Parmigiano Reggiano exploded in status. Wealthy merchants stocked it. Nobles served it sliced in golden bowls. Popes requested it by name. And travelers wrote sonnets about it. Seriously, sonnets. What makes it so special? Let me walk you through it. First, only milk from specific provinces: Parma, Reggio Emilia, Modena, parts of Bologna, and Mantua. Cows are fed a strict diet. The milk is raw, unpasteurized, and never older than 24 hours. Second, the curd is cooked and formed into massive wheels, each weighing over 80 pounds. They're soaked in salt brine, dried, then aged for a minimum of 12 months. But some go far longer. I've seen 7-year wheels that could probably survive a small earthquake. Alberto lets me help flip one of the wheels mid-aging. It's awkward and oddly satisfying. He grins. Now you're part of the process. I feel like I've just joined a very exclusive guild. What's wild is how much record keeping was involved, then and now. Even in the 15th century, cheese wheels had markings to trace their origins. Some were stamped with the name of the abbey or estate, others branded with tiny symbols that acted as edible passports. One document I read describes a wheel marked with the Lion of Modena sent to the court of Ferrara as proof of loyalty. Historians still argue whether this kind of branding was about pride, traceability, or simply Renaissance marketing flair. I'd say all three. And let's not forget, these wheels were incredibly valuable. During the Renaissance, Parmigiano could be traded for land, livestock, even marriage contracts. One dowry record from 1497 lists 6 wheels of seasoned Parmesan, not less than 20 months old, as part of a noblewoman's wedding package. She also brought linens, silverware, and, oh yes, a goat. One ledger from a Florentine merchant notes that in 1502, he exchanged 2 wheels for an entire shipment of saffron. Do you know how much saffron that is? A lot. That's the economic equivalent of swapping diamond for a golden retriever puppy made of caviar. At its peak, Parmigiano was so prized that thieves targeted it. Yes, there were cheese heists. Some aging caves were guarded at night. Others had locking mechanisms that could rival a wine cellar or treasury vault. Alberto shows me an old iron gate at the back of the cave. This was built after someone tried to sneak off with 2 wheels in 1583. Did they get caught? He laughs. One fell on his foot. That slowed him down. Today, each wheel of Parmigiano is still carefully inspected. If it doesn't meet the exacting standards, crack, flaw, incorrect moisture, it's downgraded. Or, as Alberto puts it, We bless it and let it go. He slices me a piece right off the wheel. The texture is crystalline, the flavor nutty, grassy, with that signature burst of umami that makes you question all your life choices up to this point. I chew slowly, reverently. Honestly, I feel like I'm in church. As the day fades, Alberto tells me something that stays with me. This cheese, it teaches patience. It tells you when it's ready. And if you rush it, it turns on you. That's very Renaissance, isn't it? The idea that the best things come with time, care, and a touch of ceremony. Parmigiano wasn't made for fast consumption. It was meant to age, to earn its flavor, and to travel the world as a symbol of what careful humans could do with milk, fire, and faith. As I walk back into Parma under the soft pink of an Italian sunset, I think about all the centuries these wheels have rolled through. They've been bribes, dowries, taxes, treaties, and triumphs. They've outlived popes, survived wars, and delighted generations. And maybe that's why Parmigiano Reggiano isn't just a cheese. It's a legacy. You haven't truly felt vulnerable until you've stood in a Renaissance courtroom, reading a transcript about a man suing his neighbor over a cheese wheel. I'm in Siena now, dusty bricked, wine-dark Siena, where the archives are tucked inside what used to be a convent and now smells faintly of sandalwood and ink. The archivist here, Marco, is soft-spoken, with the air of someone who knows things he'll never fully explain. He hands me a stack of parchment pages and says with a grin, "You asked for the legal cheese files." And oh, they deliver. Because in Renaissance Italy, cheese wasn't just food, it was legal tender, property, status symbol, and occasionally, grounds for courtroom melodrama. The first case I read involves two farmers, Giorgio and Tommaso, arguing over the ownership of a shared cheese cave. Giorgio claimed he'd contributed more milk. Tommaso insisted he'd done the turning and salting. Neither had written anything down. Both had witnesses. The final ruling? The magistrate ordered the cheese split vertically down the center. Historians still argue whether this decision was symbolic justice or just hilariously literal problem solving. In another case from 1481, a widow named Filomena sued a merchant for selling her spoiled pecorino unfit for the dog, let alone the dowry. Her testimony was passionate, and her daughter's marriage, allegedly, had been delayed by the insult. The court agreed and forced the merchant to refund her, apologize in the town square, and provide 2 new wheels. They even had to be blessed by the local priest. The marriage proceeded, but it gets even better. There's a transcript from a 1490 dispute involving a monastery and a group of shepherds over unauthorized cheese grazing rights. Yes, apparently cheese grazing was a term referring to letting sheep wander too close to Holy Land and producing milk that might, by extension, result in unsanctified cheese. The monks accused the shepherds of corrupting sacred pastures. The shepherds countered that the sheep had free will. I'm not kidding. The final ruling was complicated. The monks kept the land, but the shepherds were allowed to keep any cheese made before Easter. It's unclear if this helped or just led to a secret Easter cheese black market. I really hope it did. These records are filled with similar disputes. Inheritance battles over cheese wheels stored in family cellars. Dowry negotiations that fell apart over unacceptable levels of mold. Contracts stipulating cheese as collateral for loans. One 1478 agreement, I find, reads, "Should I fail to repay the sum, the house and its wheels shall pass to my cousin, who is less deserving but nonetheless punctual." Even the way cheese was weighed and valued became a legal issue. Scales had to be certified. Rind weight could not be included in pricing unless agreed upon. One cheesemaker was fined for inflating the inner cavity of his wheels with sheep's wool to increase weight. When caught, he claimed it was a protective measure against spirits. He was fined double for insulting the court's intelligence. Marco points out that many of these legal codes came not from nobility, but from cheese guilds, organized groups of artisans who protected their methods, regulated pricing, and handled disputes internally when possible. Some towns even had cheese magistrates, officials whose sole job was to arbitrate dairy disagreements. Their robes had little stitched curds embroidered at the hems. I want one, but not all cases were dramatic. One touching entry from 1492 tells of an orphan boy who petitioned the court to receive his late mother's cheese press, which had been claimed by a distant uncle. The boy argued that he knew how to use it, had made cheese with her before she died, and could support himself. The court agreed. They even gave him a half-wheel to start. That cheese press, according to the final note, was still registered under his name 10 years later. As the afternoon light shifts through the high arched windows, I realize I'm reading more than legal records. I'm reading lives compressed into curds and clauses. Because in a society without banks as we know them, without insurance policies or formal IDs, cheese was documentation. You could own it, trade it, fight over it. It aged like memories, grew in value, and, when contested, left a very pungent paper trail. I asked Marco if he thinks Renaissance Italy took cheese too seriously. He smiles. No, I think they took it just seriously enough. And maybe that's the lesson. Today, we separate food from law, from emotion, from identity. But in the Renaissance, they all existed in the same wheel. To wrong someone over cheese wasn't just theft, it was betrayal. To gift a wheel was intimacy. To defend your curds in court, that was justice. Outside, Siena hums with late afternoon life. I buy a small wedge of aged pecorino from a shop near the cathedral. The vendor wraps it carefully and says, "This one has been judged worthy." I chuckle, but I also nod solemnly. Because here, even now, cheese carries meaning. And somewhere deep in the archives, Giorgio and Tommaso are still arguing. One rind each. I've never felt more simultaneously underdressed and overfed than at a Renaissance-style banquet held in the town of Ferrara. It's part of their annual historical reenactment week, and tonight's event is themed around a 15th century ducal cheese feast. I'm handed a velvet napkin, led into a candlelit hall, and seated between a man dressed as a court jester and a woman who claims, only half-jokingly, that she's the reincarnation of Lucrezia Borgia. She has better jewelry than I do, so I believe her. What unfolds over the next 3 hours is more than a meal. It's a cheese opera, and it makes one thing very clear. In Renaissance Italy, the dinner table wasn't just for eating. It was a stage, and cheese, particularly for the wealthy, was a headliner. The first course arrives, small, delicate tarts of ricotta and herbs, baked in crisp pastry shells and arranged in the shape of a spiral. Inspired by a 1492 ducal recipe, the host announces, "Made with milk from a single sheep named Antonia." I briefly consider asking if Antonia will be joining us. Throughout the meal, each course highlights a different cheese preparation. Sweet, sharp, melted, molded, and, at one point, sculpted into a tiny bust of Dante. I eat Dante's head. It tastes of walnuts and honey. Sorry, maestro, but this isn't just a modern reimagining. During the Renaissance, elaborate cheese presentations were common at banquets, particularly in noble households, where showing off the complexity, rarity, and artistry of your dairy was as important as your wine list or your political alliances. Historical accounts describe cheese sculptures carved into towers, animals, even mythological scenes. One banquet held by the Este family in 1484 included a tower of cheeses meant to represent their lineage, each layer from a different region they controlled. Guests were invited to disassemble the tower and eat their way through the family history. Talk about edible propaganda. And let's not forget the performances. In Florence, banquet hosts sometimes hire musicians to play songs about each cheese course. There's a documented dinner in 1496 where every dish was accompanied by a cheese-themed madrigal. The opening verse of one, translated roughly, goes, "O curd of the gods, so soft, so mild, your scent hath rendered even the bishop wild." Historians still argue whether this was satire or sincere appreciation. I lean toward both. One of the more unhinged stories I come across is from a Montois feast, where dancers emerged mid-meal dressed as cheeses, wheels strapped around their waists, curd-colored tights, and tiny hats shaped like graters. They performed a routine called La Danza del Rind, which apparently brought the house down. I hope that somewhere, someone is reviving this tradition. Cheese also played a symbolic role at these gatherings. Brie-like soft cheeses represented love and tenderness. Hard cheeses were associated with strength, wisdom, and age. A mixed platter might symbolize unity, different textures, same table. And certain cheeses were only served to honor guests. If you were offered a slice of truffled pecorino wrapped in fig leaves, congratulations, you were in the Duke's good books. One letter from a courtier in 1491 describes his shock at being served the middle slice of the wheel. Apparently, this was considered the finest portion, less dry, perfectly matured. He writes, "To be given the heart of the cheese is to be given the heart of the host." I swoon. Even tableware mattered. Cheese knives were personalized. Carving boards were decorated. There's a museum in Cremona that holds a silver-plated cheese fork shaped like a griffin, said to have belonged to a Visconti noble who refused to use anything else, even for soup. As the Ferrara banquet nears its end, we're served a dish called latte meal, a layered dessert of soft cheese, almond paste, and honey-soaked dates. It's rich, strange, and strangely emotional. The host recites a line from a 15th century poem. Cheese is not merely taste, but memory pressed to rind. And suddenly, it hits me. That's what these feasts were always about. Not just food, performance, ritual, identity. A way to say, this is who we are. This is what we know how to make. This is what we want you to remember. Because Renaissance, Italy was never about subtlety. If you had power, you displayed it. With paintings, with palaces, and yes, with platters of cheese so lovingly curated, they practically whispered seduction. Later that night, walking back through Ferrara's quiet streets with a stomach full of history and a brain gently melting like a soft robiola, I think about how food connects us across centuries. Someone 500 years ago also sat down at a long wooden table, broke bread, and reached for a slice of something creamy and strange and wonderful. And maybe, just maybe, they laughed at the same jokes, or fell silent at the same taste. Because the language of cheese, it's eternal. Some museums have paintings, some have ancient weapons. But today I'm standing in front of a cheese ledger, lovingly preserved behind glass, as if it were the Mona Lisa of dairy. Welcome to Pienza, a small hill town in Tuscany that punches far above its weight in charm, sheep, and most importantly, pecorino. If Florence is the birthplace of the Renaissance, then Pienza is the monastery where cheese quietly achieved enlightenment. Pecorino di Pienza isn't just a product here. It's a way of life. And during the Renaissance, it was revered, recorded, and ranked with a passion that borders on obsession. The ledger in front of me, dated 1475, is a thick-bound book of parchment pages, organized with elegant looping script and tiny ink illustrations. It belonged to a local cheese maker named Girolamo, who seems to have documented everything. Each page includes milk quality notes, weather conditions, animal health observations, aging timelines, and, my personal favorite, taste verdicts. One entry reads, March 3rd, slightly sour, possibly due to goat's anxiety. Recommend calming music. Another, April 17th, divine, gave a slice to the bishop. He wept. Historians still argue whether these notes were sincere, exaggerated, or a kind of culinary diary meets confessional. But one thing's clear, Girolamo loved his cheese, and he wanted the world, or at least the local guild, to know it. Speaking of guilds, Pienza had one of the most sophisticated cheese cooperatives in Renaissance Italy. Local producers pooled resources, shared salt and aging space, and held monthly tastings where members voted on which wheels deserved the official Marchio d'Onore, a stamp of excellence that allowed a wheel to be sold at a higher price or presented as a noble gift. 1482 Guild Charter outlines the rules. Milk must be from sheep grazing within 20 kilometers of the town. Cheese must be aged no fewer than 60 days. Rind must be brushed with olive oil and ash for protection. Absolutely no cow milk allowed, on pain of expulsion and ridicule. Yes, ridicule was an official punishment. The offending cheesemaker would be given a special shame wheel and forced to sell it at half price, clearly marked. There's even an illustration in the guild manual of a sad cheese with cartoon eyes and a cracked rind. Tough crowd. But what really blows my mind is how innovative these cheese makers were. They experimented with herbs, nuts, even aging techniques influenced by travelers passing through. One record describes a batch aged inside hollowed terracotta jugs. Another details a desert cheese dried in cloth bags and buried for a month to simulate arid conditions. There's also a legend, unconfirmed but tantalizing, of a cheese aged in the bell tower of the town cathedral. Supposedly, the vibrations from the bells created unique air pockets. The locals called it formaggio dell'eco, echo cheese. I need this to be real. I visit a current-day cheese shop run by a family who claims descent from Girolamo himself. Whether that's true or just excellent marketing, I don't care. Their pecorino is exceptional. They let me try 3 versions. Young, soft, creamy, a little grassy. Middle-aged, firmer, saltier with hints of hay, and old, crumbly, sharp, slightly nutty, and somehow wise. I asked the shopkeeper, Luca, what makes Pienza's cheese so special? He gestures toward the window. The sheep eat the wind, he says. That poetic nonsense turns out to be scientifically valid. The local grasses are laced with wild herbs and salt carried inland by Mediterranean breezes. The sheep nibble it. The milk changes. The flavor deepens. It's cheese alchemy. Back in the town square, I stumble on a statue, not of a duke or saint, but of a shepherd holding a cheese wheel like a holy relic. The plaque reads, "To those who shaped the land and the cheese that shaped us." It's a rare kind of town that honors its cheese makers with marble. But here it makes sense. Pecorino wasn't just food, it was economic backbone, cultural signature, and identity marker. Families passed down aging techniques like heirlooms. Weddings included cheese wheels as part of the gift tally. Some wills even specified how many wheels were to be divided among surviving relatives, with instructions for fair slicing. One document I read left 10 wheels to 5 children with the instruction, "Give the strongest rind to the one with the strongest heart." I like to meet that family. As the sun dips behind the Tuscan hills, casting long shadows across fields dotted with lazy sheep, I realize Pienza isn't preserving a tradition, it's still living it. You can feel it in the cobblestones, taste it in the air, and definitely chew it. And maybe that's what Renaissance cheese culture really comes down to: place, people, and patience. Pienza has all 3 in abundance. So next time you bite into a piece of pecorino and think it's just a topping for your pasta, think again. You're tasting a story that's been aging for over 500 years. I'm halfway up a steep hillside in northern Lazio, clinging to a rickety wooden fence, watching an elderly shepherd talk to his sheep like they're members of parliament. Giorgio, no. Claudia, yes. Bianca, stay out of the mud. The sheep mostly ignore him, except Bianca, who appears to have a strong opinion about everything. I've come here to explore something less glamorous than court feasts or cheese duels, but possibly more essential to the whole story: the shepherds. The men, and sometimes women, who actually made Renaissance cheese possible. Because behind every well-aged wheel served to a duke in Florence, there was a sunburnt, mud-caked human at the edge of a hillside, coaxing milk from a reluctant ewe. And their story? It rarely made it into the illuminated manuscripts. The shepherd I'm trailing today is Pietro. He's 84 years old, wears a straw hat that predates Wi-Fi, and claims he's never spent more than a week away from the land. His great-grandfather herded sheep here. So did his grandfather, and his father. Renaissance bloodlines, not in castles, but in pastures. Pietro tells me that in the 15th century, shepherds were a strange blend of essential and invisible. Cities needed them, towns relied on them, but they were often treated as second-class citizens. Rough, rural, superstitious. Still, their work was deeply skilled. Making good cheese begins long before the curd. It begins with understanding animals, predicting the weather, navigating uneven terrain, and timing milking to the hour. Renaissance shepherds had to move their flocks seasonally, an annual rhythm called transumanza, to follow the best grazing routes. That meant walking for days across mountains, sleeping under the stars, and carrying your entire cheese-making operation on a mule. Historians still argue whether shepherds were considered uncultured or simply unrecorded. Their voices are rare in the written record, but their impact is everywhere. Tax records list their herds. Church documents describe their offerings of cheese on feast days. And a few surviving journals, scrawled in rough Latin or local dialect, offer glimpses of their lives. One note, dated 1494. Snow came early. Lost 2 lambs. Made curd by fire. Taste of ash and luck. Another, more poetic than expected. The moon watches us milk. She is jealous of the cheese. I love that guy. Pietro shows me his traditional cheese hut. Really more of a stone circle with a grass roof. Inside, it's cool and musky. Clay pots line one wall. An aging rack leans against the other. He explains how rennet was harvested from a lamb's stomach, dried in the sun, and added to fresh milk to start the curdling process. You had to wait, he says. No timers. Just your hands, your eyes. The milk told you when it was ready. He lets me help stir a small pot of goat's milk he's warming over a fire. It's hypnotic, the rhythm, the smell, the soft whisper of the curds forming. This isn't cheese made for show. It's cheese made for survival. And here's the surprising part. Despite their rough circumstances, many shepherds took deep pride in their craft. Some even developed their own cheese signatures, tweaks in salting, unique molds, secret aging spots under certain trees. One shepherd in the Apennines was known for wrapping his cheese in chestnut, leaves soaked in wine. Another buried his for a month beneath rosemary bushes. The results? Unexpected, sometimes bizarre, often brilliant. Pietro tells me that in the old days, shepherds would trade cheese like currency during their seasonal migrations. A good wool could get you boots, wine, even information, because shepherds were also the original messengers. They crossed borders. They carried news. They knew which towns had plague and which were hiring. In a sense, they were walking Wikipedia wrapped in wool. One legend, possibly true, possibly cheese-fueled, tells of a shepherd who settled a border dispute between 2 mountain towns by delivering a wheel of cheese precisely on the disputed line, with a note that read, "You must share this as you share the land." The towns still argue about who won, but they've kept the shared cheese tradition going for 500 years. And that's the thing. The Renaissance wasn't just painted ceilings and illuminated manuscripts. It was sheep and calloused hands and wheels of cheese hauled up rocky hills in burlap sacks. The artistry of Michelangelo was matched, in its own quiet way, by the artistry of men like Pietro. We finished the day sharing a slice of his pecorino fresco, a young, mild cheese with grassy notes and a creamy texture. He cuts it with a knife that looks older than the printing press, and hands me a chunk with a quiet nod. It's humble. It's perfect. It tastes like patience. And as I chew, I realize something important. Every grand feast, every noble table, every diplomatic cheese bribe or culinary masterpiece in Florence began here, on a hill, with a man who knew his sheep by name and trusted the sky to tell him when to move. So here's to the shepherds, the silent masters, the milk alchemists, the backbone of the Renaissance cheese economy, and to Bianca, who finally comes over and sniffs my shoes with approval. There's something almost too satisfying about peeling the wax off an aged cheese. That first little crackle, the faint aroma that escapes, the sense that something ancient has just breathed. And nowhere do I feel that more than in Cuneo, a misty corner of Piedmont where the cheeses are aged not in cellars, but in caves. Literal, echoing, slightly spooky, moss-lined caves. I'm here to learn about natural cheese aging, or, as the Renaissance cheesemakers called it, affinitura naturale, the art of letting nature shape your cheese. Because while we've talked a lot about recipes, feasts, guilds, and legal battles, there's something humbler and more mystical that runs through all of it: time. And caves, it turns out, are the temples of time. I'm led by lantern light into one of these cheese caves by a man named Vittorio, whose beard is roughly the same texture as the aged Toma wheels on the shelves. The cave speaks, he says. You just have to listen. And frankly, I'm too enchanted and slightly damp to argue. During the Renaissance, aging cheese in natural caves was a common and cherished practice, especially in mountainous or hilly regions where refrigeration didn't exist and nature had to do the heavy lifting. The constant humidity, stable temperature, and microbial environment turned these cool, dark spaces into flavor laboratories. And each cave had its own terroir. You know that word from wine, but it's just as true for cheese. The walls of a cave might host certain molds or bacteria that gave the cheese its unique character. Even the airflow could make a difference. Some cheeses age better near the entrance, others deeper in the dark. One 15th century cheesemaker in Bergamo wrote, "The cheese that sleeps near the moss grows wiser than the cheese near the wind." Okay, I don't fully understand what that means, but I feel it in my soul. Vittorio explains that in the Renaissance, cheese caves were often inherited, passed down through families alongside tools and recipes. Some towns had shared aging caves, where each cheese maker marked their wheels with symbols or initials carved into the rind. I see this in one of the wheels he pulls down, a faint G etched beside a stylized goat. "This one's from Giovanni," he says. "Still ages cheese the old way. Bare hands. No machines." We walk deeper into the cave, the shelves narrowing, the cheese wheels becoming older, more pungent, more philosophical. Some of them look like they've seen things. Vittorio pulls out one labeled Reserva, a wheel that's been aging for over 2 years. It smells like old books and stormy afternoons, and something faintly nutty that I can't quite name. I ask him about how Renaissance people knew when a cheese was ready. "Instinct," he shrugs. They'd knock. Listen to the sound. Smell it. Taste a sliver. It was like raising a child. You knew when to let go. Historians still argue whether these sensory methods were more accurate than our modern lab tests. Some studies suggest experience definitory, cheese agers, could indeed predict ripeness better than a thermometer. Others claim it was luck and bravado. Honestly, knowing Renaissance Italians, probably a little of both. We sit on a low bench in the deepest part of the cave, and Vittorio slices into the wheel. The texture is dense but creamy, the aroma like grass after rain. I take a bite, and everything slows down. The silence is so deep, I can hear the cheese crack slightly as the air hits it. It tastes eternal. I imagine, for a moment, a monk in 1487 doing the exact same thing. Sitting in the dark, savoring, understanding something deep and unspoken about patience, decay, and reward. Cave-aged cheese also had economic advantages. It lasted longer, traveled better, and fetched higher prices. Noble families sometimes kept special aging caves on their estates, tended by private cheesemakers. In one case, a Florentine banker kept a detailed ledger tracking the ripeness value of his cheese stock. Some wheels were aged not for taste, but for investment. Cheese as portfolio diversification. Back in the daylight, Vittorio shows me a small stone chapel near the entrance to the cave. "This was built by my great-great-grandfather," he says, "to bless the cheese." Apparently, it wasn't unusual for cheesemakers to dedicate their aging caves to saints, especially Saint Anthony the Abbot, patron of animals, or Saint Lucina, protector of dairy mothers. Cheese wasn't just science or art. It was something spiritual. And you can feel it here, surrounded by wheels that have been touched by hands, by wind, by time, and maybe by something else. I leave with a wrapped piece of the Reserva and a faint chill in my bones. Not from the cold, but from a knowledge that this is how cheese was meant to be. Not rushed, not engineered, not endlessly processed. Just milk, salt, and time, left alone in the quiet to become something greater. So if you ever doubt whether food can hold memory, whether a bite of cheese can whisper centuries into your ear, come to the caves. They're still speaking. Sometimes a story sneaks up on you. You think you're here to talk about curds and rinds and cave mold. And then suddenly, bam, you're standing in a Renaissance nursery, reading a lullaby written about cheese. I'm in Bologna now, and I'm here to dig into one of the strangest and most wonderful corners of Renaissance food culture: how children were raised with cheese. We tend to imagine the Renaissance as a world of stern tutors, marble statues, and angry popes. But beneath that grandeur were children, sticky, fussy, adorable little humans who, as it turns out, were fed, soothed, and even taught with the help of cheese. It starts early. One of the first things I find in the local archives is a 15th century midwife's guide, handwritten in fading ink. There's a whole section labeled Nutrimento Dei Piccoli, nourishment for the little ones. It describes a simple, gentle cheese made from boiled sheep's milk and a touch of honey, strained twice, and fed to infants once they could tolerate solids. It was known as latte cagliato dolce, sweet curdled milk. One note even says, if the child cries past midnight, give him a pinch of the warm curd on the tongue, and speak the name of the Virgin. That's not a snack. That's a bedtime spell. In Renaissance Italy, cheese wasn't considered risky for children the way it sometimes is now. It was soft, local, familiar, a way to wean off the breast, a comfort food. Many recipes were designed with young palates in mind. Mild ricottas mixed with herbs, little cheese dumplings cooked in broth, even tiny cheese pies shaped like birds or animals to make children smile. Some nannies carved little smiling faces into rinds. Imagine a Renaissance Lunchable, but handcrafted and blessed. One of the strangest and most charming items I uncover is a cheese alphabet board from 1490. No, really. It's a small wooden tray engraved with the letters of the Latin alphabet, used to teach children to read. But the twist? The board came with a tray of alphabet-shaped cheese curds. The idea was simple. Say the letter, match the shape, eat the cheese. A bribe wrapped in dairy. Honestly, still sounds more effective than flashcards. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or just the invention of one cheese-obsessed tutor in Medina. But it makes sense. Renaissance Italy was built on tactile learning. If you could eat the alphabet, why not? Cheese also shows up in Renaissance lullabies and nursery rhymes. I find one scribbled into the margin of a prayer book. Curdy white and soft as cloud. Hush thee now, no cries aloud. Sleep shall come with milky cheer. Dreams of wheels and cows draw near. Imagine that being sung over your cradle. I'd fall asleep and ask for seconds. In wealthier households, children were sometimes given special cheese gifts on their name day. Soft cheeses shaped into initials, or small wheels wrapped in colored cloth. In poorer homes, a bit of cheese in a wooden bowl might be the only special food a child saw all week. Either way, it meant something. It was a gesture of care. I come across a diary entry from 1483, written by a merchant's wife. Beatrice took her first step today. I gave her a sliver of our best cheese. She squealed like a chick. Another mother writes, Johnny would not sleep. I gave him warm ricotta and sang the cheese rhyme. He quieted, but I suspect he only wanted more cheese. Same, Johnny. Same. And cheese wasn't just comfort, it was currency for behavior. A young apprentice might be promised a bite of Parmesan for finishing his Latin exercises. One tutor even recorded a lesson plan where students had to earn cheese crumbs by answering geography questions correctly. Which city is south of Naples? Reggio. Correct. 2 crumbs. This turned into something of a game in many households. Children would shout answers for the reward of a cheese flake. Competitive, snack-based learning. It's the Renaissance version of Kahoot. What strikes me most is how cheese created a shared language of love and structure. Feeding a child cheese wasn't just about calories. It was about soothing, celebrating, remembering. In one heart-wrenching letter from a father to his son, written during a period of illness, he writes, I have saved a wheel of the soft cheese you like. If you return strong, we shall eat it together in the garden. I have no idea if the boy recovered, but I hope he did. And I hope that cheese tasted like reunion. Cheese, in these stories, is never just food. It's a first word, a bedtime song, a parent's promise. And as I leave the archive and step out into the noisy Bolognese street, I pass a family sitting on a bench. A small boy, maybe 3 years old, is nibbling on a wedge of fresh cassiata while his mother braids his hair. He's humming. She's half singing. It's not a Renaissance nursery rhyme, but it's close enough. And somewhere, deep in time, a nanny in Ferrara smiles in approval. You know you've gone too deep into the world of Renaissance cheese when you find yourself sketching dairy-themed astrological charts on a cafe napkin. And yet here we are, in Florence, home of grand cathedrals, Medici power plays, and apparently, cheese horoscopes. Yes, really. It starts with a single line in a dusty Florentine household almanac from 1491. Do not begin a new wheel under Scorpio, lest it crack and betray. Wait, what? I dig deeper, and what unfolds is a surprisingly rich and occasionally ridiculous belief system where stars and curds were deeply intertwined. Because in Renaissance Italy, astrology wasn't just for royal births or military campaigns. It influenced farming, baking, bathing schedules, and yes, even cheese-making. Let me walk you through it. The Renaissance obsession with cosmic order meant that everything had its proper moment. The moon governed moisture. Mars could curdle milk. Saturn apparently spoiled rennet. And if you dared to ignore the heavens, well, your cheese might rot, explode, or offend a nearby bishop. Cheesemakers, especially in rural areas or monastic communities, often consulted lunari, astrological calendars, before starting a batch. One chart I find from 1477 suggests ideal cheese-making phases as follows. Waxing moon, best for fresh cheeses like ricotta. Growth begets softness. Full moon, ideal for brining and pressing. Fullness meets firmness. Waning moon, better for hard cheeses destined to age. As the moon dries, so shall the rind. New moon, avoid all curdling. Beware false fermentation. Historians still argue whether these practices were truly effective or just the Renaissance version of dairy folklore. But let's be honest, cheese is mysterious. If you don't understand microbes, and they didn't, the stars seem as good an explanation as any. But it wasn't just the moon. Certain zodiac signs were considered better suited for dairy activity. Taurus, the bull, was obviously a favorite, associated with strength, earthiness, and appetite. Virgo, the maiden, was also favorable, linked to purity and patience, qualities essential to aging cheese. But under Scorpio, cheesemakers were warned. One manuscript warns, "The sting of Scorpio lives in curd left unattended." I love how petty the stars could be. In some towns, horoscopes were drawn for the cheese itself. Yes, not the maker, the wheel. If a particularly expensive or promising cheese was being aged, a local astrologer might be consulted to determine its temperament. One record from Siena shows an astrologer paid 3 florins to chart the fate of a prize while gifted to a bishop. Its sign? Capricorn, obviously. Hardworking, ambitious, slightly salty, and just when I think it can't get weirder, I find a short poetic text titled For Maggie Sotto Lustel, Cheeses Under the Stars, from 1502. It assigns a cheese type to each zodiac sign. I'm not making this up. A few highlights. Aries, young Pecorino, bold, slightly aggressive, unpredictable aging. Gemini, double cream Robiola, easily divided, always changing form. Leo, aged Parmesan, proud, regal, beloved by all tables. Pisces, soft blue cheese, moody, misunderstood, goes well with pears. Honestly, I'd read the full book. There's even evidence that some cheesemakers would brand their wheels with zodiac symbols, either to signal the moon phase of creation or as a kind of luck charm. One wheel found in a Milanese cellar bore the Pisces symbol carved gently into the rind, with a note, "Blessed on a rainy Thursday, tasted on a sunny one." Even the guilds got involved. A Florence Cheese Guild manual from 1486 includes a section titled Segni e Stagioni, which advises, cheese must not fight the heavens. Let the stars and salt be your guides. It's both charming and slightly terrifying. And of course, monasteries took this all to the next level. Some abbeys recorded cheese batches with detailed moon phase notations. One Benedictine monk wrote, "The Lord may bless all cheeses, but he most favors those begun in Virgo's time." Ask a modern astrologer in Florence if any of this holds water or way. She laughs. Maybe not scientifically, but symbolically? Absolutely. Cheese and astrology both ask us to trust unseen forces. both require time. That might be the real link. Cheesemaking and stargazing are both acts of hope and patience. You follow a recipe or a chart. You wait, and you trust that the universe or your cellar will do its part. If not, you try again next season, maybe under a different moon. As the day fades and the sky over Florence turns that deep Renaissance blue, the kind that makes frescoes look believable, I sit with a hunk of Leo-aged Parmesan, a glass of wine, and the realization that humans will find meaning in anything, even mold. And maybe that's beautiful, because whether it was science or superstition, whether the stars truly blessed those wheels or not, Renaissance cheesemakers looked up at the cosmos and saw possibility. They turned that possibility into flavor. And if nothing else, I now know my cheese sign. I'm a Capricorn, obviously. By this point, I've eaten so much cheese I'm fairly certain my bloodstream is at least 12% brie. But I'm not done yet, because while the dukes, monks, and shepherds get most of the historical attention, there's one group whose cheese story has been mostly skimmed over, until now. I'm talking about the women of Renaissance Italy. Mothers, nuns, milkmaids, housekeepers. Often unnamed, often unpaid, but almost always the ones doing the actual, sweaty, back-breaking cheese work behind the scenes. And their influence? Oh, it was everywhere. Let's start in the kitchen. While male guilds oversaw the sale and branding of cheese in cities, the vast majority of domestic cheesemaking happened in homes, small farms, and convents, domains ruled by women. They didn't just stir pots or scrub pans. They monitored fermentation, adjusted salt ratios, tweaked rennet blends, and kept generations of secret techniques passed from mother to daughter like holy relics. One 1490 Florence household ledger includes a line item for Formaggio Fatto dalla Madre, cheese made by the mother. She wasn't listed by name, but the cheese was praised 3 times in the margins. Very soft, lasted well. Guests asked for more. Of course they did. In rural areas, women were often the ones milking the animals, especially goats and sheep. Renaissance paintings rarely show it, but rural records, birth logs, dowries, land contracts mention women tending flocks, curdling milk, even trading small wheels at local markets. In some hill towns, cheese became a woman's unofficial currency, used to barter for bread, fabric, candles, even favors. And in convents, cheese was basically sacred. Many nuns made cheese both for sustenance and for sale. Convents near Parma, Pisa, and Siena became renowned for their unique methods. Some aged cheese in citrus leaves, others added dried lavender. A few even experimented with early forms of cheese desserts that blurred the line between dairy and pastry. One nun, Sister Agnes of San Benedetto, wrote a small devotional text in the late 1400s called Il Latte Benedetto, the blessed milk. It was a theological reflection on the spiritual lessons of cheesemaking, patience, humility, and the transformation of the ordinary into the divine. A line I'll never forget. The curd must break to become strong. So must the heart. Historians still argue whether Sister Agnes's text was meant as pure metaphor, or she was sneakily documenting a cheese recipe in theological code. Either way, I want to hang out with her. Women also played a huge role in healing with cheese. Yes, healing. In Renaissance folk medicine, cheese wasn't just food. It was remedy. Women, especially wise women and village healers, created poultices from fresh curds to treat burns, sore throats, even infections. Some mixed goat's cheese with honey and wine for stomach ailments. Others swore that wrapping a child in warm ricotta cloth could draw out the fever. Sound bizarre? Modern scientists say there's actually some mild antibacterial logic in a few of these treatments. But back then, it was mostly trust, repetition, and anecdotal wisdom passed from midwife to apprentice. I find one such recipe in the diary of a midwife named Livia in 1481. For heat in the head, apply cool sheep's curd, pressed between basil leaves. Whisper Avenue Maria 3 times. So not only was she a nurse, she was kind of a dairy shaman. Women's knowledge about cheese often went undocumented because it was unofficial. It lived in gestures, smells, textures, how a curd looked on a hot day, or how long a cheese should sit under cloth before turning. You couldn't read it in books. You learned it by watching, doing, repeating. Some wealthy women commissioned their own private cheese books, written by scribes and filled with family recipes. One such manuscript from Venice includes careful instructions for over 20 types of home cheese, along with little notes in the margins like too salty for Cousin Paolo or perfect for Lent days. I can't explain how happy it makes me to imagine a Renaissance mom writing passive-aggressive cheese notes centuries before group chats existed. And then, of course, there are love stories. In Naples, I stumble on a ballad about a girl who wooed a boy not with perfume or poetry, but with a cheese will she age herself and wrapped in red cloth. He proposed 3 days later. The cheese was soft as her voice and sharp as her wit. Honestly, power move. Women weren't just making cheese. They were shaping identity, community, even romance with it. They may not have had statues built in their honor. Their names may not appear on the guild rolls or the palace menus. But the Renaissance cheese world rested squarely and quietly on their shoulders. So tonight, wherever you are, if you got a slice of something soft in your fridge, or a little triangle of something sharp and stubborn, raise it to the women who stirred and salted and strained in silence, who taught their daughters the magic of milk and made flavor out of firewood and thyme. To the grandmothers, to the milkmaids, to Sister Agnes. They didn't just make cheese. They made culture. At some point on this journey, I stopped thinking of cheese as food. It's a ritual, a currency, a love letter, a punchline, and, here in Renaissance Venice, something even stranger, a weapon. No, not like hurling a cheddar will across a battlefield. Although now that I think about it, that sounds incredible. I'm talking about cheese as political leverage, as diplomatic persuasion, as the smooth, aged wedge that slipped quietly into a negotiation and tipped the scales. Because while Renaissance Italy was a feast of city-states, Florence, Milan, Venice, Naples, the Papal States, they weren't exactly besties. There were alliances, betrayals, trade wars, full-blown wars, and all kinds of scheming behind closed doors. And in those delicate conversations, when money was too crude and weapons too loud, cheese stepped in. Let's start with Venice. In the late 1400s, Venice was a powerhouse. It had ships, silk, spies, and a trading network that stretched from Istanbul to Amsterdam. But it didn't have great pasture land. It relied on imports for dairy, particularly aged cheeses from the north and creamy ones from Emilia-Romagna. So when tensions rose with inland cities, Venice didn't just send soldiers. It sent cheese buyers. One surviving letter from a Venetian merchant to a noble in Parma reads, "We entreat your grace for continued shipment of the wheels aged past the solstice, that our tables may remain generous and our votes agreeable." That's diplomacy with a rind. Historians still argue whether cheese was ever officially used as a bribe, or whether it was simply a polite, delicious gesture in a long dance of favor and flattery. But in reading the letters, so carefully worded, so specific about texture and aroma, you start to see the outlines of something very intentional. A 1497 note from Milan to Genoa. Should our vessels receive safe passage this winter, we shall send 24 wheels of our finest, the kind with the delicate vein, as your wife prefers. Tell me that's not the suavest bribe in history. Sometimes cheese was a peace offering, sent ahead of a difficult negotiation to warm the table and the mood. One Florentine diplomat, preparing for a meeting with a hostile bishop, brought a wheel of rare mountain goat cheese wrapped in violets. The bishop, according to his diary, softened notably after tasting it. Honestly, same. And then there's the papal court. The Pope himself was surrounded by a constant swirl of offerings. Fine fabrics, gold, spices, books. But cheese? That was intimate. It came from your land, your animals, your people. A wheel of cheese wasn't just a gift. It was a geopolitical flex. Look what my soil and sunshine can do. One account tells of a duke who sent a wheel of Parmesan so large it had to be rolled into the Vatican by 4 men. It bore the duke's crest and a Latin motto etched into the rind. Peace ripens slowly. The Pope responded with a blessing and a bishopric appointment for the Duke's cousin. Coincidence? Sure. There are even records of cheese embargoes. When tensions rose between Siena and Florence, the Florentines banned the import of certain sheep cheeses in protest. Markets were disrupted, merchants protested, and eventually, a compromise was brokered, not over territory, but over how sharp the cheese could be. The agreement allowed aged wheels of no more than 60 days, with a clause forbidding strong spices. Imagine the United Nations arguing over truffle content. I meet a local historian here in Venice, Clara, who shows me a catalog of Renaissance diplomatic gifts. It includes spices, rare birds, an alarming number of pears, and at least 17 types of cheese. One entry from 1503 includes a note. Gift received with delight. We'll share it among council. One member swooned. We laugh, but she leans in. Cheese wasn't just food. It was trust. You didn't eat cheese from someone you didn't believe wouldn't poison you. It makes sense. Cheese has intimacy. It's handmade, handled, aged in darkness and silence. To share cheese with someone was to say, I trust you to know me. And so, cheese became a diplomatic language. The hard cheeses meant resilience. The soft ones, vulnerability. The rare ones, status. The spiced ones, personality. And in a world without microphones, without Twitter, without press releases, you could say a lot with a well-timed gift wheel. So next time you picture Renaissance politics, don't just imagine stern men in velvet robes shouting over maps. Picture the silence that falls when a servant enters the chamber with a cheese board. Picture the pause, the slicing, the tasting, the nod. And know that in that moment, something shifted. A war delayed. A marriage approved. A treaty nudged toward ink. All because someone thought to age that will 6 months longer and wrap it in rosemary. I'm standing on the worn stones of an open-air market in Lucca. Early morning mist curling around canvas stalls and sleepy roosters yelling at nothing in particular. The scent of bread, figs, sweat, and yes, cheese hangs in the air like a dream that hasn't quite woken up. And this is where our story shifts from courts and caves to the beating heart of the people, the cheese markets. If the Renaissance had a Spotify playlist, the cheese market was the dance track, loud, chaotic, full of rhythm and character. Markets were where rich and poor collided, where farmers came to sell, nobles came to sample, and local gossips came to pretend they were shopping while collecting scandal. Cheese wasn't just one product on the list. It was a headline act. Every city-state had its own variation, but here in Lucca, the cheese section is sacred. In the 1400s, stalls were assigned by license, passed down through families. One stallholder might sell only goat cheese, another only mountain cow cheese. Competition was fierce. So was pride. Some producers would literally sleep next to their cheeses the night before market day, both to protect them from theft and to absorb the good air, whatever that meant. In Florence, the weekly cheese market at Piazza della Signoria was such a spectacle that local poets wrote verses about it. One begins, the smell arrives before the cart, the buyers jostle, the coins fly, and wheels spin like fate. Historians still argue whether these markets were more about commerce or community. And honestly, it was both. You might sell 3 wheels and buy a prayer candle, overhear a debate about the Duke's mistress, and then get in a fight over whether sheep cheese should be salted once or twice. Spoiler, it should be salted twice, says everyone from Tuscany. What fascinated me most, though, was the language of cheese sales. You couldn't just stack wheels and hope for the best. Sellers sang. They told jokes. They made wild claims. This cheese cured my cousin's stutter. One bite and you'll see angels. A duke once proposed marriage after tasting this. Marketing departments today wish they had this kind of flair. One merchant even hired a small boy to follow him around shouting, "Best in Lucca? Best in Lucca!" every few minutes. When the cheese sold out, the boy just switched to shouting, "Told you so." Then there were the tasting rituals. Buyers would tap the rind, sniff the edge, sometimes hold a cheese to their ear like it could whisper secrets. Some even brought their own knives. If you bought without tasting, people would assume you were a tourist or possessed. You could find fresh ricotta wrapped in leaves, semi-soft robiolas swaddled in cloth, or wheels of aged pecorino stacked like golden shields. Some stalls even specialized in cheese pairings, suggesting which honey, fruit, or wine to serve with each wheel. One pairing I tried, smoky goat cheese with quince jam, made me consider proposing to the vendor on the spot. Cheese markets were also social barometers. If a cheese seller was missing, people noticed. If a new cheese appeared, they asked questions. Who made this? Why is it green? Is it supposed to be green? Entire neighborhoods might debate a new curd style like it was a political candidate. And the gossip. A wheel of cheese might arrive with a whispered backstory. This was made during the eclipse. The milk came from a cow that survived the lightning. This was aged next to a monastery wall where saints once walked. That last one turned out to be true. I bought a wedge. It smelled like moss and incense and regret. Loved it. One of my favorite finds was a set of cheese weights. Hand-carved stones used to weigh wheels in the days before standardized scales. One stone bore the faint outline of cat. The vendor told me, "This is the lucky one. I only use it on cloudy days." Naturally, I bought more cheese from her than anyone else. Even the deals had drama. Haggling over cheese wasn't just economic, it was theater. You had to flirt with the price, threaten to walk away, sigh dramatically, praise the maker's grandmother. And when the vendor finally caved, fine, but only for you, you'd both grin like co-conspirators. Because that wasn't just a transaction. It was a story. In some towns, festivals grew out of these market traditions. Entire days devoted to cheese contests, parade floats made of dairy, and competitive aging. One festival in Pienza still crowns a king of pecorino. The crown? Made entirely of dried cheese rind. Naturally. And here's the magic. This market rhythm hasn't vanished. I talked to a vendor named Paolo whose family has sold cheese in Lucca for 5 generations. "We don't change much," he tells me. "My grandfather shouted, I shout. He sliced the wheel like this, see? He makes a smooth, practice cut. Still works." He handed me a sample, soft, pungent hint of rosemary. And as I taste it, I get it. This is more than cheese. This is continuity. It's Renaissance memory in edible form. Markets were the heartbeat, the stage, the cheese opera, and every wedge came with a side of laughter, exaggeration, and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of truth under all the noise. I've chewed my way through hills and history, through moldy manuscripts and waxy wheels. But tonight, under the high stone ceilings of an old dining hall in Ferrara, I'm stepping into the most theatrical chapter of all, where cheese became performance. Because in Renaissance Italy, it wasn't enough for cheese to taste good. It had to impress. We're talking feasts where cheese was sculpted, staged, sung about, where wheels rolled down banquet tables like bowling balls, where noblemen commissioned cheese statues and cheese illusions to awe their guests and flex their wealth. This wasn't dinner, it was dairy theater. The Renaissance nobility had a thing for dramatic food. Sugar castles, roast peacocks redressed in their feathers, pasta colored with crushed violets. But cheese? Cheese was the wild card. It could be shaped, melted, stacked, and revealed in surprising ways. Let's start with the cheese sculptures. One party thrown by the Este family in Ferrara in the 1490s featured a table centerpiece shaped like the goddess Fortuna, entirely carved from aged provolone. Her wheel, yes, of fortune, actually spun. Guests were invited to break fate by slicing a piece of her robe. Another banquet, hosted by the Gonzaga family, reportedly featured a life-size lamb made of layered ricotta and dusted with cinnamon. A guest poked it and declared, "It is holier than I." The room laughed for 10 minutes. Historians still argue whether these stories are exaggerated or faithfully recorded. Some say Renaissance chroniclers tended to embellish. Others claim the cheese theatrics were so over the top that even modern accounts seem tame in comparison. One real account I find, from a chef named Bartolomeo Scappi, think the Gordon Ramsay of the 16th century, includes a recipe for a hidden cheese surprise. The dish? A hollowed-out wheel of pecorino filled with hot polenta, raisins, pine nuts, and a tiny live bird. When the wheel was sliced, the bird flew out. Guests gasped, Scappy notes casually, like that's a normal Tuesday. And then there were cheese reveals, my favorite kind of culinary magic trick. At formal dinners, servants would parade in with towering cheese cakes made of stacked wheels, only to slice them open and reveal smaller cheeses hidden inside. One account even describes a cheese pyramid that concealed warm fritters, gently steaming when the top was removed. It was the dairy version of nesting dolls, or edible pyrotechnics. Beyond the visuals, cheese also appeared in theatrical interludes, those little performances between dinner courses. In one playlet performed at a Milanese wedding, a person dressed as Senior Cassiata, Mr. Cheese Wheel, battled Il Burro, Butter, in a comedic duel over which was more beloved by noble stomachs. Cassiata won, thanks to a surprise speech praising his firm moral character and moderate saltiness. People cheered. At another event in Florence, actors performed a cheese love story, where a soft goat cheese fell in love with a truffle, only to be tragically melted during a fondue gone wrong. I'm not crying, you're crying. And let's not forget the cheese games. Yes, games. Some feasts featured rolling contests where guests tried to guide a wheel across a table without it falling. Others had guess the rind blindfolded tastings, with points awarded for naming region, milk type, and aging method. One duke reportedly won a gold ring by correctly identifying a 2-year-aged Toma with only one sniff. Legend. But beneath all the showmanship was something deeper. These performances weren't just about fun. They were symbolic. Cheese represented bounty, transformation, mastery over time. It was humble in origin, milk and salt, but elevated through craft. To feature cheese in a grand display was to remind guests of the host's refinement, resources, and yes, his sense of humor. In a world where dinner was diplomacy and every dish was a statement, Cheese said, "I know tradition, I honor the land, and I can still surprise you." One of my favorite finds is a menu from a Venetian masquerade ball, where the final course was listed simply as cheese, but not as you know it. Under that, a note from the host: "Fear not, it shall sing." Theories abound, but some believe it was a dish where heated cheese released tiny bursts of steam through hidden reeds, creating a soft, whistling noise. Cheese that sings. I'd sell my socks to witness that. Today, we might call this kind of thing cheesy. But in the Renaissance, cheese was culture, chemistry, spectacle, and soul, all in one. And as I leave the hall in Ferrara, the echo of laughter and imaginary birds still ringing in my ears, I realize something. The cheese never just sat on a plate. It danced. It told jokes. It surprised. It whispered, "Watch this." And then it delivered. I didn't expect to find ghosts on this journey. But here I am, in a narrow alley in Cremona, standing outside a weather-worn house with no plaque, no guide, no fanfare, just a faint smell of straw and something faintly buttery. They say an old cheesemaker once lived here. A woman. No surviving name. No written legacy. Just a single local legend. That she made a cheese so perfect, it wept when sliced. The story's absurd, obviously. Cheese doesn't cry. But the fact that people still tell it, that matters. Because cheese leaves behind more than aroma. It leaves memory. And tonight, I'm chasing that. How cheese of all things became myth. Let's begin in Mantua, where I uncover a 16th century folk tale titled La Formaggio Stregata, the Cursed Cheesemaker. It tells of a girl who aged cheese with such precision and patience that villagers accused her of witchcraft. One day, she vanished. But her cheese wheels? They kept aging perfectly untouched for years. People claimed the cave sang when you stepped inside. Historians still argue whether the tale was based on a real person or whether it was created to explain unusually good cheese found in an abandoned cellar. But you can see what's happening here. Cheese crossed into legend. These weren't just snacks. They were characters. In Naples, I read about the Mad Wheel, a supposedly cursed round of pecorino that passed from owner to owner, bringing bad luck unless eaten under a full moon. In Venice, there's a love story about a gondolier who left a cheese wedge on a widow's doorstep every morning for a year until she agreed to marry him. When she finally asked why, he simply said, Because it's the only thing I make better than your sadness. I can't decide if that's romantic or terrifying. But what fascinates me most is how cheese became sacred in these stories. A monk's dying wish was to smell the rind of a wheel he'd aged for 20 years. A farmer buried his best cheese in the garden, so the worms would remember him fondly. One woman reportedly named each wheel like a child and wept when they were sold. Okay, that one hits a little too close to home. Over time, superstitions formed. Cheese left overnight on a windowsill might attract good dreams. A cracked rind was a bad omen, unless it cracked along the east side, which meant incoming love. Dropping a piece of cheese? Terrible luck, unless you ate it off the floor within 3 seconds. The Renaissance 5-second rule. Some of these beliefs were tied to old seasonal rhythms, curing rites, harvest rituals, even fertility symbols. One tradition in rural Amelia involved placing a small cheese under the bed of a newlywed couple, so their marriage would ripen with grace. Others were simply stories that stuck because they were weird and beautiful, like the tale of a traveling merchant who carried a wheel of cheese through every city in Italy. He refused to eat it, refused to sell it. When asked why, he said, "This is my map. This is my memory. Every smell is a street." Honestly, that might be the most poetic thing I've heard in weeks. These cheese legends aren't in textbooks. They're in heart songs, side notes, and parish records, murmured by elderly shopkeepers between weighing wedges. They're what happens when food lives long enough in a place to start growing stories instead of mold. And they're still happening. I meet a cheesemaker named Antonio in a tiny Umbrian village. He swears one of his wheels hums slightly during storms. Just a vibration. He shrugs, but only that one. I don't ask questions. I age it longer than the others. Another woman in Pienza tells me her sheep won't give milk unless she plays opera during milking. Mozart works best, she says, then winks. But never Wagner. Makes the curd mean. Are these stories true? Does it matter? They're alive. They shape how people treat the cheese, how they taste it, how they talk about it. It becomes not just a food, but a companion. A little wheel of biography. You age a cheese, and it ages you back. And if you're lucky, or weird enough, it becomes a story someone else tells. I think of the nameless woman from Cremona. No documents, no recipes, just a whisper about a weeping wheel. It's absurd, but I believe her cheese existed, because some flavors are so good, they haunt you. The first time I bit into Renaissance cheese, I didn't expect it to taste like memory. But it did. Not my own exactly, but someone's. Someone who'd stirred milk in a dark kitchen 500 years ago, humming to herself while the wind tapped on the shutters. Someone who'd wrapped a wheel in cloth and set it in a cool cellar, hoping the mold would bloom just right. Someone who didn't know her cheese would last a season, let alone echo through centuries. And now, here I am, at the very end of this strange, bloomy, gloriously absurd journey, surrounded by old stone, empty plates, and a head full of stories that smell faintly like cave-age pecorino. Because this wasn't just a history of cheese. It was a story of ambition, weird science, romance, spite, art, faith, poverty, luxury, healing, and hope, all molded into wheels and curds and rinds by people who thought that cheese was worth writing about. And now I get it. Because cheese isn't just food. Not in the Renaissance, not now. It's something slower, stranger, stickier. It clings to you, not just to your fingers, but to your stories, your rituals, your sense of home. They wrote about it in love poems. They argued about it in taverns. They bribed each other with it, cured babies with it, aged it like treasure, shaped it into angels, rolled it down hills, sang songs to it, whispered secrets into it. They wrote entire books about it, and they were right too. Tonight, I sit under the soft flicker of a candle in a quiet room somewhere between Siena and nowhere. On the table in front of me is one final wedge, a small triangle of aged goat cheese, wrapped in fig leaf, just beginning to crack at the edges. I break it open with my fingers. I smell, I taste, and for a moment, I swear I hear something. A murmur of goats in the hills, a low laugh from a kitchen, a whisper of parchment turning in candlelight. Because the cheese is still talking. It always was. Let's soften things now. Let the rind settle and the breath slow. No more festivals. No more duels with butter. No singing wheels. Just quiet. You followed me through misty fields, noisy kitchens, crumbling libraries, and moonlit markets. You've watched monks whisper to curds and nuns bless ricotta. You've walked cobbled streets where cheese was currency and carved your way through legends that still linger like smell in a cellar. But now, the stories rest. The torch flickers lower. The knives have dulled. The wheels have aged. Breathe in through your nose, slow, steady, and imagine the soft weight of blankets across your chest. The faint scent of something warm and old and comforting. Maybe you're in a quiet farmhouse in Amelia. Maybe you're tucked into a bunk in a Florentine monastery. Or maybe you're just you, right here, now, listening, resting, letting the day dissolve into a slow, golden melt. Whatever's weighing on your mind, let it drift. Like whey from curd, like steam from a pot. You are allowed to sleep now. There is nothing else to study, no more flavors to learn. The cheese has said its piece, and so have I. Thank you for wandering with me. May your dreams be gentle and strange and delicious. May your night be long and quiet, and may you always know when a story is done.